listen to the testimony, ask a question when it's their turn, and then leave. This is a legislative hearing. It's a legislative markup. It started later. It's subcommittee. It's not full committee. Members can go back and forth, and if the minority agrees, votes can be rolled. If you choose not to agree, then votes will not be rolled. But I will agree that it'd be better not to have it simultaneously, but there are occasions when it can't be helped. This is one of those times. This is a subcommittee markup, which will hopefully lead to full committee markup next week or the week after. And given all the things that's happened, I think it's appropriate. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes Ms. Blackburn for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Before I begin my opening, and I will submit the full statement, I just would like to remind the former chairman of the full committee that during the health care debate, we saw a PAPACA bill go to the floor, and the amendments that had been placed in the very brief markup we had in full committee had been stripped for that bill, specifically rural health care. So I would just remind you that there were some things that did not please us during that last Congress, and I do want to applaud the chairman for having hearings.
Gentlelady, yield to me?
No, sir, I've got 3 minutes.
Oh,
I think that the goal of this
very
legislation is laudable. We need to attack identity theft. We need clearer enforcement rules. We need to provide certainty for businesses, some of which have been the victim of very sophisticated online attacks in recent months. I think no one challenges the good intentions of the bill. I think there are some sections that as we move to full committee that we need to do some work on. Preemption is one, rulemaking authority is one, enforcement is one, and the trigger in Section 3 is another. I want to thank the chairman for allowing the amendment that will address the rulemaking authority that Mr. Olson and I will bring forward a little bit later. Preemption language in Section 6 has too many carve-outs and not enough teeth to pass an implied preemption analysis. We can prevent this legislation from being tied up in the courts if we address it. The current language could expose a company to a host of lawsuits, even if a company is 100% compliant with the new statute. A trial lawyer could begin to bring some suits forward, and I think our chairman addressed that appropriately. So looking at these carve-outs in subsection B2 and all of subsection C, page 31, are going to be important. The rulemaking authority I mentioned, and we will get to that later in our markup. This is a good, solid starting point, and I am looking forward to continuing to work on the bill to improve it as we move forward. Now, yield back.
I thank the gentlelady and recognize Mr. Bass for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I appreciate this hearing. I think it's a very important issue. The issue of data security is not new to this committee. In fact, I recall supporting a similar bill, at least on the subject, back in 2005. Since then, the number of data breaches has multiplied, Lord knows how many times, and it has become a significant source of insecurity on the part of both consumers as well as entities that conduct business using the Internet and so forth. It hurts large companies, it hurts small companies, it hurts countless numbers of individuals. It has become identity theft and data security breaches, and their impact on our society has become a major issue that many of us deal with in our congressional offices. And I think it's high time that this committee move forward with a substantive plan, which we have before us today, that balances the need to provide protection and predictability with the need to make sure that we don't create a whole new set of problems through the passage of the legislation. I look forward to working with you and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle as we move forward with this bill and send it to the full committee. And I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes Mr. Harper for 3 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for your leadership and continuing Congress's efforts that have now spanned several Congresses and changing majorities to enact a comprehensive federal response to data breaches. Consumer information traveling over the web and being stored by companies has become a daily routine, if not a necessity, in order to participate in a world economy. Unfortunately, there are individuals, groups, and some foreign actors that would like to exploit this information for criminal purposes. In today's age of technology advancements and near real time, it is impossible to prevent every attack, but consumers must be confident that the companies that they provide their information to are doing everything possible to safeguard their information, and that he or she will be notified in a timely fashion that a data breach has occurred and what information was compromised. The legislation we have before us today is an excellent first step to ensuring that this goal is met. While I'm concerned with certain aspects of the Safe Data Act, I look forward to working with the Chairman to ensure that these concerns are addressed, and with that I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back, and the Chair now recognizes Mr. Lance for 3 minutes. All right, Mr. Lance waives, and we recognize Mr. Olson for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for holding this markup today. As I have said in our past hearings on data security, I believe there is strong bipartisan agreement that we need to move forward with federal data security legislation. We need a uniform standard instead of a confusing patchwork of laws. And the Chairwoman has worked diligently and tirelessly to advance a comprehensive data security bill, and she should be commended. But I think it's important that the bill we report out of this subcommittee and ultimately to the House floor is a balanced bill that protects consumers without putting unnecessary burdens on companies or hindering the important use of data. Today, I'm going to offer an amendment with my colleague from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, that will strike some of the excessive APA rulemaking authority granted to the FTC in Section 5 of this bill. As currently drafted, the bill appropriately defines the definition of personal information. But the bill also allows the FTC to go in and modify the definition of personal information. And after receiving testimony directly from FTC Commissioner Ramirez, we know that the Commission is not going to be shy about opening up that definition and expanding it beyond Congress's intentions. Such a modification would completely reform the scope of the bill and the obligations under it by expanding the set of covered data in ways the FTC later deems appropriate. We can't take that risk. We can't abdicate our lawmaking duties to an unelected body. I have shared these concerns with the Chairwoman, who has been very gracious in understanding what I'm trying to achieve today with the amendment that I will offer. I thank the Chairwoman for her leadership in moving us forward with a comprehensive data security bill, and I look forward to continuing to work with her and my colleagues to improve the bill as we move forward. I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. Are there further members wishing to make opening statements? Mr. Pompeo, Mr. Kinzinger? Both waive? Okay. Seeing no...
Madam Chairman, I have a U.S. Chamber of Commerce letter pertaining to the bill that I would like permission to submit for the record.
All right. All right. Without objection? All right. The Chair calls up H.R. 2577 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 2577 to protect consumers by requiring reasonable security policies and procedures to protect data containing personal information and to provide for nationwide notice in the event of a security breach.
Without objection, the first reading of the...
I object.
The clerk will read.
A bill to protect consumers by requiring reasonable security policies and procedures to protect data containing personal information and to provide for nationwide notice in the event of a security breach. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the Secure and Fortify Electronic Data Act or the Safe Data Act. Section 2, requirements for information security. General security policies and procedures. Regulations. Not later than 1 year after the date of enactment of this act, the Commission shall promulgate regulations under Section 553 of Title V United States Code to require any person engaged in interstate commerce that owns or possesses data containing personal information related to that commercial activity, including an information broker and any third party that has contracted with such person to maintain or process such data on behalf of such person, to establish and implement reasonable policies and procedures regarding information security practices for the treatment and protection of personal information, taking into consideration the size of and the nature, scope, and complexity of the activities engaged in by such person, the current state of the art in administrative, technical, and physical safeguards for protecting such information, and the cost of implementing such safeguards. 2. Data security requirements. Such regulations shall, taking into consideration the quantity, type, nature, and sensitivity of the personal information, require the policies and procedures to include the following. A security policy with respect to the collection, use, sale, other dissemination, and maintenance of such personal information. B, the identification of an officer or other individual as the point of contact with responsibility for the management of information security. C, a process for identifying and assessing any reasonably foreseeable vulnerabilities in each system maintained by such person that contains such data, which shall include regular monitoring to detect a breach of security of each such system. D, a process for taking preventive and corrective action to mitigate against any vulnerabilities identified in the process required by subparagraph C, which may include implementing any changes to security practices and to the architecture and installation of network or operating software. E, a process for disposing of data in electronic form containing personal information by shredding, permanently erasing, or otherwise modifying the personal information contained in such data to make such personal information permanently unreadable or indecipherable. F, a standard method or methods for the destruction of paper documents and other non-electronic data containing personal information. B, data minimization requirements. A person subject to the requirements under subsection A shall establish a plan and procedures for minimizing the amount of personal information maintained by such person. Such plan and procedures shall provide for the retention of such personal information only as reasonably needed for the business purposes of such person or as necessary to comply with any legal obligation. C, exemption for certain service providers. Nothing in this section shall apply to a service provider for any electronic communication by a third party that is transmitted, routed, or stored in intermediate or transient storage by such service provider. Section 3, notification and other requirements in the event of a breach of security. Requirements in the event of a breach of security. Any person engaged in interstate commerce that owns or possesses data in electronic form containing personal information related to that commercial activity following the discovery of a breach of security of any system maintained by such person that contains such data shall, without unreasonable delay, 1. Notify appropriate federal law enforcement officials of the breach of security unless such person determines that the breach involved no lawful activity. 2. Take such steps necessary to prevent further breach or unauthorized disclosures. 3. Identify affected individuals whose personal information may have been acquired or assessed. And 4. Not later than 48 hours after identifying affected individuals under paragraph 3, unless the person makes a reasonable determination that the breach of security presents no reasonable risk of identity theft, fraud, or other unlawful conduct affecting such individuals, notify A, the Commission, and B, as promptly as possible, subject to subsection C, each individual who is a citizen or resident of the United States whose personal information is known to have been acquired or accessed as a result of such a breach of security. B, special notification requirements. 1, third-party agents. In the event of a breach of security of any third-party entity that has contracted with a person to maintain or process data in electronic form containing personal information on behalf of such person, Such third-party entity shall A, take the actions required under paragraphs 1 and 2 of subsection A, and B, notify as promptly as possible such person of the breach of security. Upon receiving notification from the third-party entity under subparagraph B, such person shall take the actions required under paragraphs 3 and 4 of subsection A. 2. Service providers. If a service provider becomes aware of a breach of security of data in electronic form containing personal
Will the clerk
information-
suspend? If I could be recognized for a minute.
The gentleman's recognized.
I know that this bill is being read because the Oversight Subcommittee is having a hearing. And I don't know of any other committee that has had a markup scheduled before a subcommittee that has delayed subcommittee hearings. It's one thing if it would be two subcommittee markups. But I've asked Cliff Stearns to adjourn his subcommittee, to recess it until this markup is done. And I just put members on notice that we'll start markups in subcommittees in the future a little bit earlier, 8 or 8:30. But I've asked Mr. Stearns' subcommittee to recess till this one is over so that all members can be here, and would ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read.
Reserving the right to object, and I'd like to be recognized.
The gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman for calling on the other subcommittee to recess. We are sending a signal to you that the practice that Mr. Dingle and Mr. Barton and I engaged in, where we did not have simultaneous committees meeting at the same time when there's a markup.
If the gentleman will yield,
No,
that is...
no, not yet. I'm recognized on my reservation. Is one that I think we ought to adhere to. If we have an agreement to do otherwise, that's one thing. But when we don't have an agreement, I don't think that the members ought to be treated this way, and certainly those of us in the minority. We are in the minority, and we have only the rules to protect us so that we can offer amendments. This bill is not very satisfactory to us. I'm sorry we weren't brought in on the negotiations in development of this bill. We have amendments to highlight the deficiencies in it. That's what we can do in the minority, and hope that the majority will pay attention to us. We do want to be paid attention to because we represent the same number of constituents that you do, each of you in the majority. And so I'm going to still insist that this bill be read. Well, until I know for sure that the other subcommittee has recessed.
It's recessed. I talked to Cliff Stearns and I asked him to recess. He said,
well, under those circumstances, I will not object to the bill being considered as read, and I hope we don't have this kind of situation in the future. Withdraw my objection.
Reserving the right
My
to
reservation.
The gentleman reserves.
I kind of like the bill being read. It forces me to listen to it. I will not object if the chairman doesn't want me to, but the young man reading it actually reads in a way I can understand, and it's helpful.
All right, so moving along.
I'm going to remove my objection to the bill being considered as read.
I appreciate that. And I would just actually, let me see what committee is sending down my way. Nothing. Okay. So let's go ahead and, without objection, the bill is considered as read. And now, are there amendments to the bill? Does anybody seek? Okay. The chair recognizes Mr. Olson. For what purpose does Mr. Olson seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
An amendment offered by Mr. Olson of Texas.
Is there a discussion of the amendment? Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
I thank the chair. I'm pleased to be partnering with my friend and colleague from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, on offering this amendment, which will strike the FTC's APA rulemaking authority to define personal information. The bill as currently drafted has appropriately defined the term personal information. This definition stands well on its own. We cannot delegate our lawmaking responsibilities to the FTC and allow an unelected body to unilaterally modify this definition. Such a delegation could completely reform the scope of the bill by expanding the set of covered data in ways the FTC deems appropriate. The mere provision of allowing such discretionary authority to the FTC would create significant business uncertainty and regulatory environmental risk for all businesses in America that handle customer information. It should be noted that there are not corresponding state data breach notification laws, none that I'm aware of, that allow the adjustment and modification of the definition of personal information by a state's consumer protection agency. In general, state data breach notification statutes set forth a set of narrow notification rules for businesses and law enforcement and no secondary rulemaking authority other than delegated powers given to state consumer protection agencies. Our comprehensive federal bill, which will preempt the patchwork of state laws, should do the same and not delegate more power to the FTC. It's important to note that the Olson-Blackburn Amendment only strikes the APA rulemaking authority to define personal information. Under APA rulemaking, the FTC can adopt rules very quickly, as little as 60 days, without taking into account something as important as economic effect. However, under the Magnuson-Moss regulating process, which has been in place for over 35 years, longer than some members of this committee have been alive, the FTC is required to take a more thoughtful and deliberate approach to rulemaking, and such a requirement to provide a statement as to the economic effect of the rule, taking into account the effect on small businesses and consumers when issuing the rule. It's common sense. This economic effect consideration is not required in a Section 553 APA rulemaking. So my colleagues, the Olson-Blackburn Amendment does not take away the FTC's ability to change the definition of personal information. It just takes away their ability to quickly and abruptly expand and modify the definition through a quick APA rulemaking process instead of considering the economic effects. The FTC could still technically alter the definition of personal information through other means, such as the more thoughtful and deliberative Magnuson-Moss rulemaking, or by coming to Congress and asking a change to see if there's a demonstrated need. I urge all of my colleagues to support this common sense amendment, which will help eliminate excessive FTC APA rulemaking authority and create certainty for American business and industry. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion?
Madam Chair, I would like to speak in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, the bill before us, 2577, already severely hampers the FTC's ability to ever add to the definition of personal information by requiring that several determinations be made by the agency, including that any change not impede technological innovation. This term is unclear, it's undefined, it's untested. The agency has never had to weigh this in its directed rulemakings. I already had major concerns with this provision because I believe it will lead to unending challenges to the FTC's authority on this and leave the Commission unable to expand the definition of personal information. Now, this amendment seeks to erect even more roadblocks by taking away more streamlined APA rulemaking and instead requiring the FTC to use the incredibly hard to overcome rulemaking process known as Magnuson-Moss. The FTC has issued almost no rules under this process because it is almost impossible to overcome. And we should be giving the FTC the ability to be flexible and adaptable to changing threats to consumers from the collection of their information, not putting in law a definition of personal information that is already outdated and ineffective. I'm going to urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Yes, I will yield.
I thank the gentleman. Again, I just want to emphasize that we are not taking away the rulemaking authority. We are making sure that we in Congress have a say here. I mean, Magnuson-Moss is a much better system than allowing the APA authority. I mean, again, in this economic environment, and one thing that I applaud the President for is wanting to, reduce the government burdens, the regulatory environment here, to get America going again, get us creating jobs, and this amendment does that.
Well, let me reclaim my time. The FTC needs discretion. It does not need an absolute rule. It needs discretion in order to resolve these issues as we go along. I oppose the amendment.
Well, gentlemen, yield one more time.
I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Madam Chairman.
Ms. Blackburn is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I thank the gentleman from Texas and appreciate the opportunity to work with him on this amendment. Indeed, it is an important amendment, and it's an important correction to this bill. Now, in today's Wall Street Journal, there is an article about how the agencies cannot handle the impact of rulemaking authority. When we pass bills and we send them to the agencies for rulemaking, the SEC says they're overburdened. The FCC says they're overburdened. They can't handle this. So it is imperative that we, as members of Congress, do a couple of things. Number one is to be more definitive. If we think something is going to need the impact and the force of law, we need to put it in the statute. Number two, we don't need to kick the can over to the agencies and say, when you get around to it, get it done. The article in today's Wall Street Journal talks about the impact of Frank Dodd and how they're coming up on the year anniversary and how they're struggling to get through this rule-making process. And then what do we hear here in Congress? Well, we don't have enough people. We don't have enough money. You need to send us more money if you're going to require us to do these rules. So let's not get into this as we look at data security. Let's be definitive. That is what we're doing with the amendment. It claws back that, says the APA rulemaking authority is not going to be there for the FTC. We have a good definition of personal information. We need to stick with this. Look at what Commissioner Ramirez said in the June 15th hearing. She indicated that the agency would all but certainly use new authority to expand the definition of personal information far beyond Congress's intentions, saying, and I'm quoting her, "I think that the touchstone here is information that can be uniquely tied to an individual, broader than the definition that is currently used in the draft bill," end quote. So as we have had hearings on the bill, as we have talked our way through what a process should be for data security, we have heard from the FTC that they would like more authority than what they were given in the draft bill. We're saying they need less. I encourage my colleagues to support the amendment.
Would my colleague yield?
I do yield to the gentleman.
Thank you very much. Just to follow up on your very wise comments about our amendment. All our colleagues should know, my colleagues should know that the Marketing Research Association has sent a letter of support for the amendment that's been offered from my colleague from Tennessee and myself. And also we received positive supports from the National Retail Federation and the Retail Industry Leaders Association. So this is a common sense legislation that ensures that the regulatory environment doesn't kill American jobs and actually helps our businesses. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding the time back, and I will add to his remarks that we also have a letter from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce addressing this personally identifiable information. And reading from the letter, while the Chamber appreciates the limitations placed on the FTC's ability to modify the definition of PII, we believe that the FTC's ability to modify the definition through their current rulemaking authority is sufficient. Providing the FTC with additional rulemaking authority in this case would create regulatory uncertainty and harm businesses' ability to innovate. And not only to innovate, Madam Chairman, as we have worked on the issue of jobs, we hear repeatedly that the uncertainty from the regulatory agencies is indeed inhibiting jobs growth. Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion?
Madam Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
To oppose the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Last year, this committee reported out by a very heavy margin a bipartisan bill which passed the House on suspension. All of a sudden, that is not good enough. So now we're going through, and first of all, we have a bill that is not very good. It doesn't protect people. Now here's what is at stake. At stake is the ability of people to be secure in their personal information. And the bill consistently, in all of its parts, cuts back on that security. It reduces the definition of those things which are personal security related information. And it makes it harder for for that information to be properly protected. Now this is bad, because if you haven't been aware of it, there's a major problem with regard to personal information, business information, and other kinds of information being stolen by a bunch of sharpshooters who are taking away from the people their security. As a result, people are being destituted, they're being bankrupted, and all manner of other mischiefs are attending to them. Now, the bill doesn't require the FTC to update the definition of personal information. It simply gives it the authority to do so. It allows for administration by that agency in a way which makes sense, which protects ordinary individuals and, very frankly, which protects also businesses who do need the same kinds of protections. Look at some little guy on the street as you drive down the road, and you will see he's in business installing windows or running a garage or selling auto parts or doing whatever he might happen to be doing. He needs these protections just as much as the ordinary citizen does. So taking away the Administrative Procedure Act in this case is ridiculous. Now why? Because it forces then the Federal Trade Commission to rely upon Magnus and Moss. If you want to absolutely assure that there will be no protection from people in terms of their personal information and things of that kind, this is a splendid way to do it. Because we have found over the years that under Magnus and Moss it takes 10 years to complete a rulemaking. And this business of raiding personal information and steps of that kind being taken by sharpshooters and rascals around the country is something which won't sustain that kind of delay and which will not permit then the FTC to take steps to protect the ordinary citizen against the evil consequences of this information being stolen and being used to destitute the individual, to steal his identity, to put him into bankruptcy, or to do all manner of other evil and wicked things. Now, it forces this step that we're having in this amendment is just one of a sequence of amendments that we're going to have offered today, and the changes in the legislation. And the interesting thing about the changes in the legislation are that it always makes it harder for the citizen to protect himself in personal information which is necessary to be secured against some of these sharpshooters stealing his identity and taking away from him those few protections which he has. Remember that when all things else fails, the American people look to their government to protect them. And there's one thing they're going to wonder about is, why is it that this Congress is not increasing their protections, but rather is taking protections away from the American citizenry without any collateral or commensurate benefits in other places? So, what we're doing here is just making it harder for the ordinary citizen to go to his government and get protected by the agency which has traditionally had this responsibility, the Federal Trade Commission. And you're going to find that it won't probably affect any of us in this room at this time, but you can be just dead certain that in the orderly passage of time, somebody's going to say, just who in hell could have done that kind of thing to me and to the American people? I oppose the amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? The gentleman from Kansas, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I'd like to rise in support of the amendment.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
You know, I listened to the gentleman from Michigan who's been a great defender of this body's power for a long time. This isn't partisan. This is about who's going to make these decisions on a definition, whether we want to turn over that authority to the FTC or if we want to do it here. Indeed, the other side has offered numerous amendments where we're going to talk about the scope of the definition. And so from my perspective, what we're trying to do here is make sure that it is this body. As you said, when folks are trying to protect their privacy, they turn to the federal government, they turn to us, their elected officials, to protect those rights and those important things. And so I can't see why we would turn that over to the FTC. And who knows what the FTC will look like 5 years or 10 years from now. It might shrink the definition of privacy. It could change it in many ways. I just think that's the authority that we ought to keep, and so I support this amendment.
Is there further discussion? For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
May I be recognized in opposition?
Yes, the gentleman is recognized in opposition to the amendment for 5 minutes.
The problem with this bill is that it says it's to protect consumers by requiring reasonable security policies and procedures to protect data containing personal information and to provide for nationwide notice in the event of a security breach. Well, that sounds great until you realize this bill doesn't do much. It doesn't protect a lot of data that people think ought to be protected, and I agree with them. I would want the data to be protected to include my personal emails. I don't think anybody ought to have access to that. Or my personal photographs or videos that I put on the line or books or other consumer purchases. I don't know. I don't think anybody ought to be able to access from my data if I purchased over-the-counter drugs. It's just none of their business. But these things are not protected under the existing bill. Why aren't they protected? Because of a narrow definition of the term personal information. We're going to offer amendments on our side to expand that definition. The gentleman wants Congress to do it. Let's do it right. But under the bill, personal information is so narrow that these things that I cited are not covered. But not only are they not covered, the amendment before us would make sure that the FTC doesn't broaden the coverage to protect people's privacy and the breach of their data. So if you want us to trust the Congress, we're going to have to change this bill to include a lot of things that people ought to have protected, we all want to have protected. There's not even protection for information about, as I mentioned in my opening statement, if you have in your phone the location of where your children are at any moment. I don't want people to know that, but I can't protect that data under this legislation. And I wouldn't allow the FTC to be able to protect it either if they wanted to expand it through rulemaking. The FTC has had a burden under the Magnuson-Moss regulations that make it impossible for them to act. It's taken decades before the FTC has been able to act. Other agencies operate under the Administrative Procedure Act. I think FTC ought to be able to operate under those same rules. The amendment that is before us is to take a bill that's so narrow and make sure it cannot get widened in terms of the data that can be breached and people can have protected. And that is not the right direction for us to take. I strongly
would the gentleman yield?
Amendment. Who's asking me to yield? Yes, I yield to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman from California. I just want to inform the gentleman that the definition of personal information that's in this bill is consistent with 46 states and their definition of personal information. So it's not some sort of untested thing. It's been tried and proven effective in the 46
states. That's not our understanding of the bill. And not only that, this bill, as I understand it, preempts the states from being even more protective than this minimal federal law would provide. Gentlemen, want me to yield any more to him? Because I think he's incorrect in the information he has.
Well, if the gentleman will yield to me.
Certainly.
Thank you. The former chairman
I believe in yielding. I'm not like some people who don't even yield because they don't want to be challenged. In what
appreciate that, but Then yield, please. Okay. The gentleman repeatedly refers to the 2007 bill or previous bills that we have passed out of this committee and speaks to the bipartisan nature and how good they were and how well crafted they were. And I think that's all very true and a good starting place for us to continue to examine this problem. In the previous bills, the gentleman aware that the definition of PII as written in that language specifically is where we took our information. In that bill, it said the term personal information means an individual's first name or initial, last name or address or phone number in combination with any one or more of the following data elements for that individual: Social Security number, driver's license number, passport number, military ID number, other similar number issued on government document used to verify identity, financial account number. And I'm wondering if the world has shifted so dramatically that today that this bill, you want to change the definition that you were very pleased with and keep referring back to this bill, yet our definition of PII...
Well, if I can reclaim my time because it's about to expire, just to respond to you. The previous bill did give the FTC, under the Administrative Procedure Act, to further expand the definition of the privacy information that people wanted to have protected. This amendment would restrict the FTC from doing that, and the bill, I think, is much more narrow than what we had in our previous proposed legislation.
Well,
so I oppose the pending amendment, and I'll be happy to yield, but I've run out of time, but whatever the chair wants.
Gentleman's time has expired. And is there further discussion on the amendment?
Madam Chair.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I seek recognition to speak in opposition.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, this bill before us is already severely hampers the FTC's ability to ever add to the definition of personal information by requiring that several determinations be made by the agency, including that any agency not impede, quote, technological innovation, end of quote. This term is unclear, undefined, and it's also untested. The agency, the FTC, has never had to weigh this type of requirement and precondition in its directed rulemaking, not ever before. Madam Chair, I already had major concerns with this provision because I believe that it will lead to unending challenges to the FTC's authority, and we had an indication of that already in this markup, and will leave the Commission unable to expand the definition of, quote, personal information, PII, which is a real concern that we have. Under the bill as passed in previous Congresses, the FTC had the authority, and we gave them the authority. It was stated authority. As a matter of fact, it encouraged them to expand the definition of PII. Now this amendment seeks to erect even more roadblocks by taking away more streamlined APA rulemaking and instead requiring the FTC to use the incredibly hard-to-overcome rulemaking process known as Magnuson-Moss. I remember, Madam Chair, because I chaired this committee in the last Congress, we asked the FTC to give us an idea, be explicit about it. Let us know what is your process and how long will that process take under Magnuson-Moss. And they went line by line in the hearing and said that it would take at least 10 years to get rulemaking through the FTC utilizing Magnuson-Moss. The FTC, Madam Chair, has issued almost no rules under this process because it is almost impossible to overcome the restrictions.
Would the gentleman
yield? No, I won't yield as of yet. After I finish, I'll yield. We should be giving the FTC the ability to be nimble, to be flexible, to be adaptive to changing threats to consumers from the collection of their information, not putting in law a definition of personal information that is already outdated and ineffective. Madam Chair, I think that this amendment, this bill that's before us, that this is need something that will severely handicap the American people because it severely handicaps the FTC. And I think that we can do a much better job. I really believe and wish that we had followed up on the pattern and the method that we used
with the gentleman yield?
Congress when I finish our yield. And that is that we will have more attempts to have a bipartisan involvement. If we had more discussions, rather than the majority trying to ram this down the throats of the American people and down the throats of this side of the aisle. Madam Chair, I really sincerely and wholeheartedly object to this bill and to this amendment. I just think that it could have been better done, and I think that what your intentions are will not be met. And maybe your intentions are not what's being stated in your preamble. Maybe your intentions are not really what you're saying. Maybe you're saying one thing and doing another. That's the only conclusion that I can draw. You're saying you want to protect the private information of the American consumer, the personal information of the American consumer, but it seems to me like you want to hamper the American
Time
consumer.
has expired.
Madam Chairwoman.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
To strike the requisite words, ask counsel a question.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to make sure I understand the amendment. It strikes a number of words on page 28. If the amendment is agreed to, I want to read and say if the council agrees with me. If we accept the amendment, it would say the commission may by rule modify the definition of personal information under subparagraph A. Is that correct? Is that correct?
Could the gentleman repeat the inquiry? I didn't fully get it.
If we accept if the amendment is accepted, the modified language would say on page 28, beginning on line 20, the commission may by rule modify the definition of personal information under subparagraph A. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And what that would mean is not necessarily that you have to follow this cumbersome procedure that Mr. Dingell and Mr. Rush just referred to, but simply that the commission could still modify the definition, but they would have to do it by a rule that they promulgate. Is that correct?
Yes, it is correct.
So the minority's contention that if you accept the amendment, you go to this cumbersome process is not correct.
My understanding is that the Commission lacks General Administrative Procedure Act rulemaking authority, and so that although it does have to go by rule, that if it is defaulted to a rulemaking procedure, that they do have to follow the Magnuson-Moss procedure.
Well, they would have to follow.
That is my understanding.
That they couldn't just adopt a rule of their choosing.
I don't believe so.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Point of order, Madam Chair. If there are questions of counsel, the procedure has always been to have counsel at the table, and I think that would be appropriate if we're going to have counsel answer questions.
I thank the gentleman. We will make the change. Is there further discussion on the amendment? All right. If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The gentleman requests a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll. Oh, the gentleman withdraws. Can we do that? Okay, we withdraw the request.
Would the chairman yield for a unanimous consent request?
The gentleman.
Could I make a unanimous consent request that that any votes on the amendments between now and when the House takes its first series of votes on the House floor be rolled until after the votes on the House, till 15 minutes after the votes on the House floor.
Is the gentleman suggesting voice votes or roll call?
No, any votes ordered that, well, it would be roll call votes requested that they be rolled until after the first series of votes on the House floor.
Reserving the right to object, so I can ask the chairman a question. Are we going to have the other committee meeting at the same time?
I was going to suggest that the other hearing, knowing that we wouldn't have any recorded votes here until probably 1:45. I'm told that the first series of votes is expected on the floor between 1:15 and 1:30. Don't know how many votes there will be. But that would then allow the Oversight Subcommittee to resume its first panel. I don't know if
Will the gentleman yield?
the gentleman will yield to me. If I yield to the chair of the Oversight Subcommittee, I don't know where exactly you are in terms of the first panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We practically have been through the members asking on the first panel, including myself, Mr. Gett, and including Mr. Dingle and Mr. Waxman have all asked their questions. We have all these patients, 7 witnesses who are sitting up there patiently, and I think with just a little finesse we can get through them and then be done with the first panel and get the administration, who's been patiently waiting right after the votes, and we could do that, or if Mr. Waxman felt we could delay the reconvening of the Oversight Committee after we got through the first panel and reconvene the administration tomorrow, if Mr. Waxman likes. But I would certainly ask the other side to consider the fact that these patients, there's 7 of them up there, has been waiting, and we could get through it pretty quickly before the votes, and I just would ask that consideration.
Further clarification, if one of you would yield. You're suggesting you would reconvene your subcommittee to complete the first panel.
The first panel, yeah, and there's only about 2 or 3 left.
And then you would not have the testimony or the questions of the second panel.
That's correct.
Until when?
Till after you finish this hearing.
Till this subcommittee
This subcommittee's done, and if you go all day today, then we'd have him come tomorrow.
Okay. I withdraw my objection.
Okay, so again, let me just make my unanimous consent request that any recorded votes on amendments between now and when the House has its first series of votes on the floor will be rolled until 15 minutes after that first series of votes concludes on the House floor.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't know that that's necessary. We haven't had any roll call vote.
But you may have some.
Well, you may have some, and then there may be another one that would be dependent on how the first one comes out. And so let me withhold temporarily. Let me check what other amendments, whether we'd be disadvantaged by not having a roll call vote before we proceed to the next amendment. And if that's not a problem, then I will object.
The gentleman withdraws.
I withdraw my request.
All right. Are there any further amendments at the desk?
Madam Chair, Mr. Upton. Mr. Chairman, I've consulted over here. We think that that'll work out okay, so I will agree to your unanimous consent.
Okay,
request.
so I'll remake my UC request that any votes on amendments that are asked for recorded vote are rolled until 15 minutes after votes are concluded on the first round of floor votes on the House floor this afternoon, which then allows the Subcommittee on Oversight Investigations to resume its first panel promptly.
Without objection, so ordered. And are
Madam
there
Chair?
further amendments at the desk?
Madam Chair.
Madam Chair.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Madam Chair, just by unanimous consent, just want to make an announcement then. Members on the Oversight Investigation, if you want to ask questions on the first panel, just kindly come up because we're going to wrap up the first panel.
Mr. Waxman, which number? An amendment offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, millions of Americans rely on the Internet to communicate or store and sometimes share in limited ways what they reasonably believe is personal information. H.R. 2577, however, essentially says that your personal emails, your personal photos, your personal videos stored online aren't personal at all. Because this bill does not see those things as personal, webmail services like Gmail or Hotmail, photo sharing sites like Flickr, social networks like Facebook and Google+, don't have to protect these things, and they don't have to tell you if anyone breaks into their systems and looks at or takes these things. I think every one of us here agrees that our emails are personal and private. The same goes for photos or videos we back up and store online. To some extent, we also expect that any photos or videos that we choose to share with a limited and select group of people will remain within that circle. I think this bill should respect common consumer expectations, and they expect these things to remain private and to be secured against any unauthorized and potentially harmful access by hackers. My amendment would make sure we do that by including in the definition of personal information all personal electronic communications, photos, and videos stored online, along with any other similar content the FTC determines is personal. I think this is a common sense change. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. And I'd be happy to yield to anybody who wants me to yield. Otherwise, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there discussion on amendment?
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Yes, please to yield to.
If we accept your definition, Mr. Waxman, do we keep the definition that's here in terms of Social Security number, driver's license number, financial account number, and we just add to it? Is your amendment?
That's correct.
Additive?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment, and I would just like to explain to probably both sides of the aisle here that this is really sort of the crux of the debate here on how you define this. Clearly people are worked up on both sides over this topic, and I would say to both sides that between subcommittee markup and full markup, we ought to have a very robust discussion about these. And I spoke earlier with the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, about my belief that privacy and data security are they're very similar, yet they're also very different. And I believe that much of what the gentleman from California is referring to really moves into the privacy realm. And I certainly echo and understand and underscore his concerns, but I would ask him that we have these discussions between now and the full committee. And not only do we ask about PII and what it is, but where does it go from here? And, you know, in Congress and much of what we do, there's a sweet spot where you try not to go too far, but you want to do the right thing. And we're trying to find that sweet spot. But what the gentleman is offering to me sounds like it potentially can go too far. It sounds like the unintended consequences of his suggestions could go very far, and I believe we need to kick them around a lot further before we would adopt them. So I would urge a no vote on...
Gentleman, yield?
Yes, I will be happy to yield.
Well, the amendment says the term personal information also includes personal electronic communications, personal photographs and videos stored online, and other similar personal content that the Commission determines should be included in the definition of personal information. I don't see what's objectionable to that. I don't know what any unintended consequences would be. If we vote this down, we're in effect telling people, I don't know what, wait till a privacy
will yield.
Wait till a privacy bill, but this is a data breach bill, and if this data is breached, people want to know about it.
If the gentleman will yield, there's to me, I see it clearly different. I see what happened with Sony and Epsilon and these massive data breaches. Clearly, there weren't photographs involved in those cases, and I would ask the gentleman, if a photograph, say on somebody's Facebook page or something that they've tweeted or anywhere, how that could be stolen for personal identity theft, how in fact just a photograph would do that. And trust me, I certainly understand and respect an individual's right to privacy, but I think in this case, a photograph does not mean that you're going to in fact steal somebody's identity.
Gentlelady, yield further?
Yes.
Sony and Epsilon wouldn't even be covered by this bill. So data breaches that they experience wouldn't even be covered by this legislation. But what we're talking about are data breaches that are obvious, that people, I think, want protected. Their personal photos and videos stored online, their personal electronic communications. So I
would the gentleman yield?
respectfully disagree with you, and
would the gentleman yield?
About the amendment, it's not my time.
I'll be happy to yield.
I was just going to ask the gentleman from California if this language was in the previous bill, 2221, before I was here in Congress. Was this definition part of the PI in the previous bill that you were talking about earlier this morning?
Yeah, we expected in that last legislation that after FTC rulemaking, this would be covered.
But it wasn't in the bill.
No, but that was
passed and
dealing
voted
with more
for a bill that
financial
didn't
records.
contain this.
But we gave the FTC authority, and I think if we're going to, as we did by the First Amendment, make it harder for the FTC to act because we want to make the decisions, we ought to put this into the law.
All right. I yield back the balance of my
Wait, I'm sorry. Would the chairman yield for me?
Yes, I'll yield.
Just a brief comment. I mean, I oppose this amendment just because it's basically undo what we just did. We just passed an amendment to restrict the FTC's regulation of the PII, and this amendment would just undo just what we just did. Let's move forward. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and would
I'd like to be recognized to support the amendment.
As soon as I am done with my time. To the gentleman from California, when he said our definition of personal information is the same as yours from the last Congress or 2009, you said that we allowed the FTC to amend. But that's where the point about institutional competency really comes in. Was their plan to have a modest definition of personal information and to have the FTC and all these other things? But that does not cede the Congress's role to the executive branch. And I know that my time has expired, and I am recognizing Mr. Butterfield for what purpose?
For the purpose of supporting the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, I strongly support the amendment offered by Mr. Waxman. You know, I've read this amendment 2 or 3 times, and there's nothing radical about this amendment. You know, it simply says that the definition is also going to include personal electronic communications. There's nothing radical about that, and most consumers would expect that to be part of the definition. Personal photographs and videos stored online. There's nothing radical about this amendment. It is a common sense amendment. It is what the American people would expect us to include in this definition, and so I would ask my colleagues to support the amendment.
Would gentlemen yield?
I will yield.
I just want to clarify a point.
Yeah.
In the last year's bill, we spelled out some things in the legislation, but gave the FTC the authority to go beyond it. What we have, by virtue of the First Amendment that was adopted, is a very strict limitation on FTC's ability to go beyond what's in the legislation. That's why I think it's important to put this in the legislation itself, so that we are clear that we want this personal information to be protected. And I agree with you. I do support this amendment, and I hope my colleagues will vote for it as well.
And reclaiming my time, I mean, this is a legislative prerogative. We are directing the FTC to include these 3 things in the definition, and nothing radical about this.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will yield.
I believe that I'm going to oppose this amendment, but I believe that Mr. Waxman makes a point. If we're going to restrict the agency's ability to expand the definition, this is an appropriate debate to have, and between now and the time this bill comes to the full committee, I think it should be carefully, all of these amendments, I know there are a lot more after this, should be very carefully considered and possibly added. Yield back to the friend.
I thank the gentleman.
And if the gentleman will yield to me.
I will.
I thank the gentleman. And again, to echo Mr. Bass's point, this is what I'm trying to say is, again, the base language that we took was out of the previous bill and started that, but by no means is that an end point. And I also agree with Mr. Bass that if we're going to define it ourselves, then we need to kick it around a heck of a lot. And again, reiterating my request and my statement to the minority that I look forward to kicking this around. And certainly, as a Californian, I think we take great pride in leading the way in technology, and some of my colleagues might argue the fact and say that they do too, but as Californians, these things really matter, and they have, again, potential impacts that I think we need to discuss before we adopt them. So again, I want to reiterate my opposition to the amendment.
Madam Chair, would you yield, please?
It's not my time.
Reclaiming my time, I'll yield to the gentleman from Illinois.
Madam Chair, I just want to remind those members who are present, 2 years ago we had this discussion, and we decided in the bill that we passed that we were not going to try to be exhaustive in terms of trying to itemize and list the covered items here. We concluded that we weren't the technological experts and that things do change. So we gave the FTC the flexibility to add more services, Facebook, other IP services. We gave them the authority to do that because we knew that we could not, in the bill, exhaust all these future instruments and devices and applications that would be utilized, that would be covered, that would need to be covered under the legislation. So we gave them that authority. We didn't try to restrict and restrict them in terms of the future and what they will be faced with in the future. And I think that right now, this list that you have here is not exhaustive. You know, as a matter of fact, by the time we finish voting in a few minutes on this amendment, it would be obsolete. So I really think that we are, I think that Mr. Waxman's amendment is really the appropriate way.
I thank the gentleman reclaiming my time. I do recall when we debated this bill, when you offered it in the last Congress, Mr. Rush, and I do recall that we did delegate to the FTC some authority to revisit and to expand the definition. But under Mr. Waxman's amendment, this would be a minimum. These three things must be included in the definition, yet giving flexibility to the Commission to expand it. So I agree with your assessment and that of Mr. Waxman. My time has expired. I thank you.
I thank the gentleman. And is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. No. And the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Well, I'm going to ask for a roll call, so. Okay, let's show a show of hands.
The chair requests a roll call vote. And on that, because of our prior UC, we will roll the vote until later today. So are there further amendments?
Madam Chairman? Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Which amendment, Mr. Kinzinger?
It's the email and password one.
An amendment offered by Mr. Kinzinger of Illinois.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm supportive of my colleagues' efforts to remove the FTC's authority of determining what personable, identifiable information should require notice. But I'm concerned that we're leaving too many openings for criminals to obtain access to things online. My amendment would simply add the combination of email address and password as identifiable information. 60 to 75% of the public use the same password for everything. If a thief steals your email address and password, it's more than likely or not that they're going to have access to multiple accounts that would allow easy access to all information stored online. Now, this committee has a role to play in determining what should be included as personally identifiable information
and any information that could be used to access or steal other information should be included. I want to continue to work with this committee in addressing this issue, and I know there's some concerns on some of those details. So in the interest of that, Madam Chair, I'll go ahead and withdraw this amendment, but ask that we continue to work with the committee to address this situation.
All right, the gentleman's amendment is withdrawn, and I thank the gentleman very much and appreciate that he's heard my message.
The gentleman has yielded to me to make one comment. I don't see any problem with your amendment. We ought to protect people's email address and their password, but I want to point out that after you've protected that, you haven't protected the emails inside. That's what we just voted on, or we're going to vote on in a few minutes. I know this is not an amendment that's pending since you've withdrawn it, but as you think about this issue, I hope you would recognize we want to protect the password and the email account number and the emails, because that is a breach of people's privacy.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Are there further amendments at the desk?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk. It's Kids 01.
The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Butterfield of North Carolina.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
I thank the chairman. Colleagues, the definition of personal information is so narrow that it includes almost none of the information that we should be concerned about with respect to a young child. I think one of the things that we can agree on as being particularly sensitive is any information regarding the whereabouts, the location of a child. Location information about a child can make them susceptible to stalking or kidnapping and any other number of unspeakable harms. But location information about children isn't required to be secured under this bill. I believe we must make sure that anyone who keeps a record of this information should have at least some minimum obligation to secure that information. My amendment would require that by including in the definition of personal information any information that identifies the location of a child under the age of 13. The FTC would also be authorized to expand that definition of personal information to include any other information about a child under the age of 13 the FTC determines should be included. I think we can all agree we need to do all we can to keep our children safe, particularly when the Internet and mobile device applications have made it easy to know where they have been and where they're going in real time. Having this information, Madam Chairman, is great for parents, but we need to do everything to make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. This amendment is one way to do that. I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? Chair recognizes herself in opposition to the amendment and would point out the fact that as a parent, when you're talking about the security of your children, there could, in fact, be times that you would want to do some geo-tracking. And these are my concerns, that if we jump into this, we rush into this, that we have unintended consequences where you could, in fact, not be making kids any safer. The point of the data security legislation is that we have seen harm from these. We have seen what can happen, in fact, with identity theft. And I think that these very legitimate questions that the gentleman raises are worth discussing and talking about under the context of privacy, which is a much different, in many regards, discussion and debate to have. So I would thank the gentleman for the concerns and agree that these things do need to be kicked around. And as the gentleman from Illinois said earlier, these things move so quickly, they change so quickly, technology adapts, and what we talk about today in technological terms will be different 6 months from now. And I do believe that we need to have a different and longer conversation about these, so I respectfully oppose the amendment and would urge my colleagues to do the same.
Gentlelady,
I yield back. Yes, I will yield.
As I understand the amendment is, if Apple, for example, has your location because of your individual iPhone, and so they know your location, and they're hacked into, this would require that they inform the parent of a child, well, I guess it would be the child's cell phone, that they be informed about it. I don't know what unintended consequences there could be. A parent wants to know if somebody's hacked into the Apple system and then they know where your child is located. Isn't that the, if I could ask Mr. Butterfield, isn't that what this amendment is all about?
That essentially, yes, that essentially is it, Mr. Waxman. You're correct.
I can't understand what reason we wouldn't want to make sure that a parent is informed that the child's location has been taken, or the identification of the child's location is now made available to somebody who's unauthorized and hacked into the system. So
if the gentleman will yield.
That's your time.
Back to me then. I appreciate this, and it points out the fact that if you could perhaps, I need to sort of think of things in concrete terms. Can you point to an example of this happening to make me perhaps see it a little bit more the way you are? We're talking theoretical in the future, and as opposed to the data breaches that have occurred in the past. And if you could just perhaps point out for me an example of this happening, I might understand it a little bit better. And I'll be happy to yield to the gentleman and if not, we can, again...
Yes, the gentlelady would yield to me.
Yes.
There are hundreds of breaches of what is going on electronically, and we just learned that the iPhone keeps track of the location of the owner who's using the iPhone. And so if that has been breached...
the gentleman is saying that Apple keeps a database of where we are at any given time, at any given place, perhaps right now, knowing that we're here.
That's my understanding, that that information has just been available. And so if there's a breach of this information about a location, let's see if the amendment, and the amendment says personal information includes identity of the location of a child under the age of 13 and other information related to children under the age of 13, then that breach of that data should go to the parent.
Once again, can the gentleman point out, rather than theoretical, that this has actually happened with a child under the age of 13, and again, under the assumption that Apple is keeping a database of where we are, rather than...
Well, it's not so theoretical. We've just been, this whole last week or so, been hearing about hacking into people's emails by Rupert Murdoch, not himself personally, but the people that work for him in England. So we know that hacking takes place, and this amendment...
Reclaiming my time, you're specific to geolocation here.
Yes.
Yes.
And
so I again just want to urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
Madam Chair,
yes, I'll yield my last 21 seconds to the gentleman.
All right, Madam Chair, I moved to strike your last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes
Madam Chair, in your bill, Section 2A, 2D, the words here, a process for taking into consideration the quantity, type, nature, and sensitivity of the data. Now, Madam Chair, that infers to me that any information of a sensitive or any data that's sensitive should be included. And what the gentleman's amendment does is just expounds upon it and makes it much more clear. But here in this section, you have a section that says that sensitive data should be included. And what can be more sensitive than a child, the whereabouts of a child, data around the child? I'm sure I think that in order to clarify Section 2A, 2D, then I think that the amendment, the gentleman's amendment is in order.
If the gentleman will yield.
I certainly will.
Thank you. Again, I just think to the numbers of times I've had to buy telephones for my children. Those phones are registered in the adult name. They're not registered in the name of the child. How would anybody, in fact, know that it is somebody under the age of 13 who has that phone in their possession, and it actually is tracking somebody under the age of 13? And again, these are why I think these questions need to be discussed and talked about thoroughly, is to understand what this means. So how, in fact...
Will the gentleman yield to respond to that. Thank you. Well, you know, when there are custodial battles, that certain people would certainly know that someone else has a telephone, that a child would have a telephone, and want to get that information. I mean, we have, I'm sure there are plenty of examples in the real world, but we certainly can all envision that situation where.
But if the gentlelady will yield for two things, and to remind my colleagues, we have a floor vote on with 7 minutes left to go. But again, the point is how does, in fact, anybody know when it's you carrying the phone or somebody under the age of 13? And these are very good questions, and again, under the context of privacy and safety, we should discuss them. And again, I don't know how, in fact, you would somehow have a separate database for when that data was collected for when the adult has it and then when the child has it. Is there a switch you flip on your phone that says the child is now carrying it around the mall as opposed to the adult?
Gentleman, Yule.
I certainly will.
Look, if we want to discuss these between now and the full committee, we certainly can do it, but it's inexplicable that you would oppose this. Anybody who has a cell phone, now that we know that your location can be identified, and that can be hacked into, should probably be notified that somebody's hacked into your phone and they can identify where you're located. But this amendment is restricted to 13-year-olds or younger. And Ms. Schakowsky points out that it could be one parent versus another. It's the kind of thing that ought to be, it's the kind of data that ought to be protected. Now, we'll talk about it, and I believe you'll come to accept this as we talk about it, but we should have talked about it before. And I think it's a terrible vote for people on this committee to say they're going to reject the identification and location of a child under the age of 13 or other information related to children. I think it ought to be broader than that, but at least for children, there ought to be determination that this is personal information that ought to, when that data is breached, ought to be made available to the owner of the cell phone, which is usually a parent. So, look, you're a new grandmother. I'm
Not
an
yet.
older
Not yet, but soon.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
I have grandchildren, and I've had children, and I would want to know if when they just have this ubiquitous cell phone they're on all the time and sending text messages, or just have it available so you could call the child, that if somebody's hacked into it, I wouldn't know. And this at least allows the person to know that their cell phone has been hacked into and their location has been identified. I think people have a right to know, certainly when it pertains to children, but I think all people ought to have a right to know if their location is being identified.
Is this your time, Mr. Waxman? Would you?
That's Mr. Rush's.
Can I ask Mr. Waxman a question?
The time has expired.
All right.
And again, I wouldn't be so quick to point that out, but we do have a floor vote pending, and would ask that we continue this markup immediately following the last floor votes. About 1:45, we will continue. So right now, the subcommittee stands.
We're not going to vote on this amendment before we go? We're not voting?
We'll be happy to put the question.
I'm asking.
Sure.
If they're prepared to vote.
All right. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye.
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 All those opposed say no. No. Mr. Barton,
I voted
my
aye.
back.
I voted aye.
Okay. Well, the noes have it.
Madam Chair, let's have
Madam
a roll
Chair,
call.
let's have a roll call vote. I only heard one no.
It was a very powerful no.
That's true. It is.
Let's put it on the record. I asked for a roll call vote.
I thank all of the gentlemen, and we'll look forward to seeing you back here at 1:45, and the subcommittee will stand in recess until then. The subcommittee will come to order, please. When the subcommittee recessed, it had rolled 2 roll call votes, the Waxman Amendment relating to personal electronic communications and the Butterfield Amendment relating to child location. So a vote now occurs on the Waxman Amendment, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, nay. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Bass. Mr. Harper. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Barton. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, nay. Mr. Butterfield.
Yes.
Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Towns. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Waxman. Mrs. Bonomack.
No.
Mrs. Bonomack, nay.
Are there any members wishing to be recorded?
Mr. Cassidy, nay.
Any other members wishing to be recorded?
Yes. Yeah, we can. It is his amendment. Yes.
Do you know where he is?
Did he vote?
Yeah, he voted. Stearns, Bass, Harper, Olson.
He was winning it.
The clerk will report the result. Mr. Waxman, do you wish to be recorded?
Mr. Waxman, aye.
And Mr. Bass?
Mr. Bass, nay.
Any other members wishing to be recorded? Seeing none, the clerk will report the result.
On that, there were 5 ayes, 10 nays.
The vote is 5 ayes and 10 nays, and the amendment is not agreed to. A vote now occurs on the Butterfield amendment. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, nay. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Harper. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Barton. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, nay. Mr. Butterfield.
Aye.
Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Towns. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Ross. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye.
And
Mrs. Bonomack.
thank you. I'd like to be recorded as a no. Are there any other members?
Mrs. Bonomack, nay.
Mr. Stearns?
Mr. Stearns, nay.
Any other members wishing to be recorded? No. The clerk will report the result.
On that, there were 4 ayes, 11 nays.
The vote is 4 ayes and 11 nays, and the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill?
Madam Chair.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Stearns?
we have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
An amendment by Mr. Stearns of Florida.
Without objection, the reading. Oh,
Mr. Stearns, which number?
It's the data minimization provision bill. It's myself and Mr. Pompeo. We're offering this amendment together. You all set? All right.
All right. So without objection, the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just speak briefly on this, and then my colleague, Mr. Pompeo, is ready to speak also. This provision, my colleagues, is a new addition from the bill that I offered back in 2005, and I want to make sure that if we're adding this provision, we're not doing so in a way that overburdens the scope of government authority. During the subcommittee June 15th hearing, I questioned Commissioner Edith Ramirez on how the Federal Trade Commission would address data minimization, and her testimony indicated that she believed the FTC has rulemaking authority in this area. I'm relieved to hear that this was not the intent of the legislation. However, I'm concerned that the FTC believes otherwise. In fact, that was what we came clearly away with. Therefore, I, along with my colleague Pompeo, am pleased to introduce this amendment to clarify, just simply clarify, that the FTC has no such rulemaking authority. And I remind my colleagues that it wasn't long ago when the Democrat Congress stripped away the FTC's APA rulemaking authority because it had overstepped its power. It's irresponsible and unwise for Congress to return this type of authority through piecemeal legislation. Therefore, this amendment would simply add the sentence, quote, "The Commission may not promulgate any regulation with regard to the establishment of such plans and procedures," end quote, at the end of Section 2B. So I ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to realize that we're just simply putting in a very simple sentence to allow Congress to have the authority and not the Federal Trade Commission with establishing rules and regulations for plans and procedures. With that, I yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Kansas.
Thank you for yielding, Mr. Stearns. I also had a chance to have a colloquy with Ms. Ramirez during the hearing, and we added this provision that said to companies you can only keep certain amounts of data, and asked her how she'd decide what was reasonable and whose property this information is, their property rights, and whose information they'd feel like the FTC had the authority to make them get rid of, even if it had value to them. And so I was very concerned as well. So I was very pleased when Mr. Stearns came up with the idea, and I'm glad to support this amendment. We've got to be real careful about giving the FTC the power. If we have certain things we want in the minimization plan, we ought to talk about them and discuss them amongst ourselves. But to give the FTC the authority to post hoc make an analysis of what data a company can keep, I think a real risk. And so I'm glad we're putting forth this amendment. I'd urge my colleagues to support it.
Gentleman yields back his time. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Seek recognition.
For what purpose?
In opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
Thank you. Madam Chair, the language of the bill states that it is up to businesses to establish plans and procedures for minimizing data. I believe it is straightforward. The Federal Trade Commission has not given any specific authority to write rules related to that language, and the bill does not grant the FTC the general authority to write whatever rules it believes are needed to carry out the act. Having said that, if later in time businesses find that they do not read the provision clearly, the FTC should be allowed through an open process of notice and comment to clarify it. This amendment's sole purpose is hamstringing an agency that is already hamstrung in its rulemaking authorities. Those of us who have been around for a couple of years know that the FTC has a particularly tough rule writing process that Congress imposed on it. The result has been that the agency hasn't written many, if any, rules since we put that process in place. Most of the rules they have written since then have been at the specific direction of Congress in law and under the more streamlined APA process allowed in each of those laws. This bill doesn't give them APA rulemaking for the data minimization plans or direct them to do anything. The chances they will act on their own are less than zero. This amendment is nothing more than more of the same from the other side, the arguments that regulations are bad. Well, in a case like data minimization, it is businesses that could be hurt, businesses that will be hurt, because they can and often do ask agencies like the FTC for clarity. This would prevent that.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will yield.
I understand what you're saying. You're saying that the bill pretty much is clear and that you don't want to specify anything in the bill that would hamper them. But you mentioned the businesses. I am telling you the stakeholders are concerned. Mr. Pompeo and I both heard the Federal Trade Commission speak on this, and clearly what she said is they're going to initiate rulemaking, particularly with data minimization. So I would think you, as a member of this committee, want to make sure they come back to us if they have to interpret anything. And so why not just support this fairly simple sentence, which really just says, in effect, that if they're going to do rulemaking, they'll come back to see us. And so we're not changing the bill, just saying basically come back to see us if you're going to stipulate beyond some rulemaking that you feel is necessary. So it's really keeping our authority for this committee. And I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Reclaiming my time. The FTC is well equipped to deal with this rulemaking, and I ask my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? The gentleman, for what purpose does he seek recognition?
The last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
It just seems to me that the bill itself states it's up to businesses to establish plans and procedures for minimizing data. We don't want storage of a lot of data that no need to be held, like we had old credit cards and things like that, the data that was breached. I think that's straightforward. The FTC is not given any specific authority to write rules. If at some later time businesses find that they don't read the provision clearly, the FTC should be allowed through an open process of notice and comment to clarify it. And so the sole purpose of this amendment seems to be to hamstring an agency that is already hamstrung in its rulemaking authorities. So those of us who've been around for a while know that the FTC has a particularly tough rule writing process that Congress imposed on it. Most of the rules they've written have been held up for a very long period of time because of the Magnuson-Moss rule making rather than the APA. This bill doesn't give them APA rulemaking for the data minimization plans or direct them to do anything here, so the chances they'll act on their own are pretty close to zero. So this amendment is nothing more than more of the same from my colleagues on the other side, the argument that regulations are bad. And I just think that we have a Federal Trade Commission. They develop expertise. When they see problems, they ought to be able to address those problems. If they think that the laws need to be clarified further, they ought to have the ability to do that. So I would join in opposition.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, sure.
In your conversation that you just did here, you indicated you don't think the bill gives the FTC rule-making authority. So then if that's true, then why would you object to just a sentence that says they don't have it?
Well, I think what...
Because basically it's just confirming what you already said.
Well, one, I don't like that they don't have it, but two, it's not just the rulemaking, it's the interpretation of the rule at a later time if there's a rule in place, and I think that they ought to be able to deal with that.
I thank the gentleman.
So I oppose the amendment.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? All right. If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Madam Chair?
For what the gentleman is recognized?
I have an amendment at the next.
Actually, let's just...
Question number 1.
Madam Chairman.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I'd like to reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved on the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois. We said it was Rush 01.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Madam Chair, Section 2 of the Secure and Fortify Electronic Data Act would require covered entities under the law to establish and implement reasonable information security policies and procedures. Under the subheading Data Security Requirements, the FTC will be required to adopt regulations prescribing that such security policies apply to the collection, use, sale, other dissemination, and maintenance of personal information. My amendment would make clear that these information security policy regulations are to also apply to online, rather to offline and paper records, and not just to personal information that is contained in electronic data or to data in electronic form, which is a defined term in Section 5 of the SAFE Act. This amendment will also clarify the zone of federal preemption with respect to state data breach laws. Among the 46 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, all of which have data security breach laws, some of those laws will extend to the protection of non-electronic data containing personal information. Another way to say this is that my amendment will make it clear that the scope of Section 2's requirements are similar enough in scope to any state laws that cover personal information found in non-electronic data. By voting to pass my amendment, we will require any and all, like that, we will remove any and all doubt that it is Congress's intent to preempt state security breach laws and policies relating to personal information that is contained in non-electronic data and paper records. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Madam Chairman, I withdraw my point of order.
I thank the gentlelady, and would just ask for clarification purposes. If Mr. Rush, you were in fact referring to Amendment Rush 01.
01, yes.
Okay. Well, we're happy to let you know that the side is going to accept your amendment, and congratulate you for that fact. So, with that, are there further amendments at the desk?
Madam.
Oh, so excuse me. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Accept it.
Okay. Is there no further discussion on the amendment? Okay. So we are accepting. I have to walk through it. If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Madam Chair.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Amendment to H.R. 2577 offered by Mr. Kinzinger.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment would provide a flat exemption for small businesses coupled with field preemption as proposed by the White House in its cybersecurity proposal. As currently written, the Safe Data Act would let the FTC decide who should be covered under security requirements and breach notification. President Obama's proposal has defined a business entity as essentially any business of any size, regardless of inter- or intrastate operation. The White House proposal proposes that only businesses that collect or store info on 10,000 people or more over any 12-month period would have to provide notice under the federal law in the event of a breach. The White House proposal then preempts all laws regarding notice affecting any business entity. The end result is that there are no state notice laws for anyone, and a business must only notice under the federal law if it collects or stores information on more than 10,000 people. My amendment would simply apply this same regime to both the notification and security requirements of this bill. I would also note that Senator Leahy included small business relief in his bill as well. It's important that this committee not create undue burdens for small business. I want to continue to work on this solution with my colleagues to ensure my amendment would not complicate the preemption of state laws. And with that in mind, Madam Chair, I will withdraw this amendment.
The gentleman withdraws his amendment, and I thank the gentleman and look forward to working with him on that. And at this point, would ask if there are any further amendments to the bill. The amendment is withdrawn. And are there any further amendments to the bill? For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2577 offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
Is that amendment
No,
41?
I'm sorry. It's Rush 041.
Yes, sir.
All right. So without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
I want to thank you, Madam Chair. Section 5, subsection 7 of the Secure and Fortify Electronic Data Act defines personal information in a manner that excludes the term, quote, public record information. Section 5, subsection 8 then goes on to define the term public record information as information about an individual that is lawfully made available to the general public from federal, state, or local government records. However, Madam Chair, that definition does not contemplate whether the information was acquired legally. With all the recent attention and scrutiny that is being paid to the News Corp phone hacking scandals across the Atlantic Ocean, we have no excuse for not perfecting this provision. By eliminating the public record information carve-out from public information, Congress will be stating emphatically that just because personal information can be collected from the public domain does not excuse entities that make it their business to collect and handle personal information to ensure that said information was legally acquired to begin with. The definition of personal information is far too important in this bill for us not to confront this potentially huge exclusion. Madam Chair, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair will recognize herself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. And just state that when crafting this legislation, we followed the model of California's breach notification law, which was the very first in the nation. That provision explicitly states that the term personal information does not include publicly available information that is lawfully made available to the general public from federal, state, or local government records. And there is plenty of precedent for this exclusion. The FTC's own safeguards rule exclude public records, including information reported in the media. The banking agency's guidance on breach notification also excludes the same information. Additionally, over 20 states have similarly excluded public information. And then to strike this provision means that companies would be subject to a stricter standard than the government regarding the same kinds of information. Worse than a stricter standard, it is a completely contrary standard. So while governments are mandated to disclose certain information and records, private companies would be mandated to protect the same information and notify consumers when someone accesses this already public information. So with that, I would urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment, and I yield back, or will yield to Mr. Stearns.
Yeah, I also want to speak against the amendment. I would say to my colleague, when you go to page 28, what you're basically doing, you want to exclude public record information. But, you know, that's what Zillow is all about. I mean, I can go into Zillow, the web page, and I can find out the real estate values. I can find out what a property sold for. I can go to the appraiser website in my hometown and find this information. And, you know, this is all public information. So I really don't understand why you want to prevent this from... You know, it says such term does not include public record information. I think the average American wants to get this public record information, and it's available today. And I'm just afraid if you did what you're saying, this would change the whole manner of understanding what public records is available, which we all assume we can either get on the internet, or we can call our appraiser, or we can, you know. So, I mean, explain to me what I just think. I think it's a bad amendment, so I urge my colleagues to vote against it.
Well, the gentleman,
it's my time, and yes, I will yield.
Yeah, I think what you're missing, and I haven't heard anyone address this particular issue, we're talking about information that has not been certified as being legally gathered. You know, there is information that is illegally obtained. And we want to make sure that the information that's on the that is under the label of public information, that information was legally gathered, and that's what this amendment addresses the legality of the information. Certainly, we do understand that we're in a changed environment now since the News Corp scandal. And
Will
so
the gentleman yield? Or with
I don't have the time. It's not my time.
It's my time, and I will gladly yield.
Well, if you go on page 29, they've defined what public record information. It says the term public record information means information about an individual that is lawfully made available to the general public through federal, state, or local government. So your understanding or what you just said about illegal information doesn't even apply because the definition is right here on page 29, lines 16 through 20.
Yeah, I would just, if the chairman would yield, I would just say there is a difference between being available and obtaining. There's two vast differences in terms of obtaining information and then making information available. I think that a higher standard here is the obtaining of the information, not the availability of it.
Right, well, reclaiming my time, I still believe that the California's breach notification law is a good model to begin with, and again, will urge my colleagues to vote against the amendment. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
I'd like to speak in favor of the Rush amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Stearns seems to suggest that these are just public records, that they're in the public domain, and therefore they should not be protected in any way. But just because information came from a public record doesn't mean that it isn't personal or sensitive. Data aggregators have your name, they have your Social Security number, they have your address, and a few of the other things this bill suggests are sensitive. And guess what? They also have your divorce records, your bankruptcy filings, your gun licenses, your hunting permits. They've gone all out and collected all of this from every city, county, and state government building that allows this information to be released. But now they've put all of this data in one place, and they don't want to take any responsibility for the damage that could be done to hundreds of millions of people because they put it all in one place. They should not get a free pass. The damage to consumers will be the same no matter where the information originates. So the aggregators of the information should be required to guard and tell people when they have failed to do so. This amendment would ensure that that happens. I support the amendment, congratulate my colleague for offering it, and I would yield back.
The gentleman yields.
Yes. I yield back, but I will yield it.
The gentleman did yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Yeah, please.
For what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I'd like to yield to my colleague, Mr. Rush.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I want to thank the gentlelady for yielding. Yeah, Madam Chair, California, I love California. It's a nice state. I like to visit it quite often. But in this instance, it's not the gold standard for privacy or for data security laws. I would draw your attention to the state of Massachusetts. And this is the wording of the security laws as it relates to the citizens of that state. And I quote these words, provided, however, that, quote, personal information, end quote, shall not include information that is lawfully obtained from publicly available information or from federal, state, or local government records lawfully made available to the general public. And Madam Chair, in this instance, I think that my amendment is certainly consistent with a more stringent, a higher level of protection for the American public, and that protection resides in the Massachusetts laws and not in the California laws.
Does the gentlelady yield back?
I yield back my time.
All right. Is there further discussion on the amendment? All right. If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. The nays have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Chair?
For what purpose does the gentleman seek?
Have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Stearns of Florida.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, the gentlelady. I intend to offer this amendment and then withdraw it. I have talked to some of my colleagues, and I think the feeling is that this should be discussed at the full committee, and plus our counsel has indicated that after we pass this bill, he could come up with report language which would satisfy us. But I thought I'd go through and explain the purpose of the amendment is to address when notification is appropriate. I want to emphasize that I believe companies should notify both consumers and law enforcement as soon as they have confirmed that there has been a breach. The question, however, is when does that confirmation actually occur? I've had the opportunity to talk to stakeholders. I've come to believe that there is no magical moment during an investigation of a potential data breach that a company confirms that a breach has in fact occurred. Therefore, I'm concerned with any legislation that creates stiff timetables for action without specifically clarifying when the clock begins to run against that company. When this is unclear, we force companies to rush to judgment, over-notify, and often confuse their customers by changing their stories once information is discovered. For that reason, I thought of this amendment to make sure companies can concentrate on determining when and whether a breach has occurred and how simply to best protect customers rather than calculating when the clock begins ticking. Accurately and appropriately addressing a security breach is obviously vital to a company's business model. No company can be the one that sits on their breach and doesn't report, because if consumers do not trust how a company uses that information, they will turn to the company's competitors quickly. Therefore, incentives for timeliness already exist. And sometimes timeliness is beyond 45 days, which is in the bill. During the hearing, we learned that it took one company 115 days to receive their forensic report confirming a breach. Most recently, the IRS took 86 days to notify customers. So think about this. If it took a giant government entity with abundant resources 86 days to notify, how can we expect a small company to do all the forensic analysis and confirm a breach within 45 days? The subcommittee appears to understand the importance of this language because they have the words unreasonable delay as included on page 5, line 9, when addressing when consumers and the FTC should be notified. And I respect that, and I think that was wise to have that language unreasonable delay in there. Confusingly, though, several pages later, however, a cap of 45 days is inserted. So right away, there's a little bit of ambiguity here. This amendment would simply eliminate this ambiguity, this confusion, and return the bill to the important regime of, quote, unreasonable delay. That was in my 2005 bill that we approved, and I think a lot of people have expressed concern that we should return to that. So I hope perhaps that we can get proper report language after this bill is sent to the full committee. And in the meantime, Madam Chair, I look forward to working with you to see if we can clarify on that. And without further ado, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment.
The gentleman withdraws his amendment, and I would just like to speak briefly to it first and congratulate you. I think that's the first time I've ever heard a member use the IRS as a model of efficiency. But you did it. And I just firmly believe in the 45 days. I will continue to work with you on this, but I do believe that it's important consumers do know as quickly as possible. And, both of those examples you cited really would have a law enforcement exemption, or by simply at the request of law enforcement, they could, in fact, extend that 45-day period. So with that, I appreciate the gentleman willing to work with me and thank him for withdrawing his.
Will the gentlelady yield just for a second?
Yes.
We can give you other cases where companies that are much smaller than the IRS who, through forensic evidence, was unable to come up within the 45 days because they were in that zone of ambiguity. So I'll be glad to give you more examples where this is certainly an area for concern. So with that, I look forward to working with you.
I look forward to it, too. And the gentleman, again, withdraws. Are there any further amendments?
Madam Chair.
Bill? For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an inquiry of the council. I have two questions.
The gentleman will state his inquiries.
Subsection 3F2 of the SAFE Act does not authorize the FTC to adopt rules pertaining to which security methodologies and technologies would suffice as the basis for a legal presumption. I would note that in one part of the subsection, the FTC is authorized to issue guidance. However, on page 18, line 4, the SAFE Act would seem to also authorize the FTC to adopt rules. Is this a drafting error?
Can the gentleman repeat the question, please, for counsel?
I want to know if subsection 3F2 of the Act does not authorize the FTC to adopt rules pertaining to which security methodologies and technologies would suffice as the basis for a legal presumption. I would note that in one part of the subsection, the FTC is authorized to issue guidance. However, on page 18, line 4, the Act would seem to also authorize the FTC to adopt rules. And so my question is this a drafting error?
My answer is yes, it is a drafting error, and on page 18, it should not refer to rules. On page 18, line 4.
Okay, well...
issuing such guidance, it should say.
Well, the second part of the... well, would a federal court or a state court applying this law then view the FTC's guidance as being only an administrative agency's advisory opinion, thereby leaving commercial entities with a weaker defense?
I believe that the Federal Trade Commission's guidance on this point would be persuasive, but not conclusive.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have a second question, and that question is, can a, quote, service provider, end of quote, also be a third-party agent? For example, when a service provider offers cloud computing or hosted services, would the service provider fit the, quote, third-party agent, end of quote, definition, which in turn would subject them to Section 3B's special notification requirements or to Section 2's reasonable security policy and procedures?
I believe there could be circumstances where a service provider is such an agent. Yes.
I want to thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Are there further amendments to the bill?
I have.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition? The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair. Madam Chair, my amendment in the nature of a substitute will strike all provisions of the SAFE Act and insert the Data Accountability and Trust Act, H.R. 1707, which I introduced along with Mr. Barton and Ms. Schakowsky on May 4th, 2011. This will be the fourth Congress in which my bill has been introduced, notwithstanding this passage on suspension in the 111th Congress. The Data Act has two basic components. First, the bill requires that persons possessing electronic data that contain personal information must take steps to ensure that that data is secure. Second, the bill establishes notification procedures that a company must take when a data breach occurs in order to allow affected consumers to protect themselves. As is the case under the SAFE Act, companies would not have to initiate such notices if they determine that, quote, there is no reasonable risk of identity theft, fraud, or other unlawful conduct, end of quote. However, unlike the SAFE Act, H.R. 1707 will also impose special requirements on data brokers, but accommodates other laws that govern how certain data brokers are regulated. With that, Madam Chair, I would ask for support from members of the subcommittee, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. We'd like to get some clarification, if I might, on whether this is Search 01 or the Substitute 01.
Substitute 01.
Okay, if we can just ask the clerk to distribute the correct amendment. We don't have it. Okay. So apparently what this amendment does, it strikes and replaces all of this bill with H.R. 2221 as passed the House last Congress. It includes access and correct provision for marketing databases. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, I didn't hear you.
Is the substitute, the amendment you're speaking to just strikes the bill and replaces it with 2221?
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Madam Chair, until the committee is ready to distribute my amendment, I will withdraw the amendment so that we can move forward.
Would the gentleman yield for just a second?
I certainly will.
Does your substitute amendment track verbatim what was circulated earlier and what was passed in the last Congress?
Yes.
Have there been any changes as far as you know?
No, it's not as far as I know.
Well, I would ask unanimous consent that we proceed with consideration of the substitute. All right.
An objection is heard, and the gentleman withholds at this point or withdraws temporarily his amendment until the committee can get it before them. Are there further amendments to the bill? For what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Thank you.
And the number is?
The clerk will report.
The number
Purchases 01.
What?
Purchases 01.
Purchases 01.
An amendment offered by Ms. Schakowsky of Illinois.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized.
Can I reserve a point of order?
Point of order is reserved. So the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Okay. We've been having a discussion a bit on whether or not this is on privacy or security, but reading from the bill itself, it says its purpose is to establish and implement reasonable policies and procedures regarding information security practices for the treatment and protection of personal information. And later it says, taking into consideration data security requirements. Such regulations shall, taking into consideration the quantity, type, nature, and sensitivity of the personal information, require the policies and procedures to include the following. A security policy with respect to the collection, use, sale, and other dissemination and maintenance of such personal information. And that's what my amendment deals with, a particular kind of personal information. And that has to do with a woman's decision to have a baby, whether or not a woman might be carrying a baby, and to whom and when she reveals that information. And those are incredibly personal pieces of information, or according to the bill, sensitive pieces of information. But a woman could unknowingly open herself up to revealing all of this to the world simply by using a frequent shopper or loyalty card at her drugstore or supermarket. These cards allow retailers to keep a record of each and every purchase we make, including over-the-counter drugs such as contraceptives and medical screening devices such as pregnancy tests. But this bill does not require retail to secure any of this information against hackers or any other unauthorized access, because it isn't included in the incredibly narrow universe of, quote, personal information, unquote, covered by this bill. I looked carefully at the definition section. It's very, very limited. Ask any young professional woman what the harm is in information about potential pregnancy getting out at the wrong time, and she will not be at loss for an answer. The denial of a job. It's not uncommon, at least in my experience, to find that young women who were seeking jobs or promotions at a time when they were also in the early stages of their pregnancies will admit to having been afraid to reveal they were pregnant for fear of not getting a job or moving up the organizational ladder. They're likely afraid because they've seen it happen to other women. The scope of personal information covered in this bill needs to be significantly expanded to require retailers to protect this and other sorts of health-related information that they collect and store. My amendment moves this bill in that direction by amending the definition of personal information to include records of an individual's purchases of over-the-counter drugs and devices, including pregnancy tests. The FTC is also given authority to expand the definition of personal information to include other health-related information it determines should be included. And I would urge my colleagues to seriously consider this amendment and to support it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does the gentleman withdraw his point of order? Is there any further discussion on the amendment?
Madam Chairwoman, I'd just like to make a couple comments. This is the same debate we've had
for 5 minutes.
Over and over on this amendment. Again, it's expanding the FTC's influence over this decisions, and giving them the power that we should be exercising here in Congress. And again, the one thing that the American public says over and over, and I go back home, their number one concern is jobs and the economy. And giving the FTC more authority and create more uncertainty, more regulations, isn't creating jobs, it's hurting jobs. And again, we've proposed all sorts of alternatives over here that address this consideration. And again, some of the things have been said about, personal information, that the things we propose in this bill are untested. It's patently false. It's been tested in 46 states. And the rulemaking process, people say, well, we're taking the rulemaking process away from the FTC. We just want to challenge them to go over, use something, the Magnuson-Ferguson at Moss Act, which is much better than the APA because it actually requires an economic effect. Again, we've got to remember the context of what we're dealing in. The American people are concerned about jobs, and we can't pass more regulations, put that burden upon them. We need to create jobs and have common sense regulations. I think this bill strikes a compromise, and I'll oppose the legislation. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition? The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
The amendment says that if they keep a track of your over-the-counter drugs, and that's hacked into, you have to be informed of that information. Now, if I could ask counsel a question. Counsel, I hate to interrupt you, but I want to ask you a question. Doesn't this bill preempt the state laws on the subject?
The bill does contain preemption provisions.
California has a law that says that your health information, such as prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, as well as other health information, is confidential. Would this law be preempted?
I think that would call for some detailed analysis. It is.
If California law said that if you're hacked into, if there's a database that's hacked into that says somebody's gotten pharmaceutical over-the-counter drugs, that has to be protected. Now, if this amendment's not adopted, that wouldn't be protected, but the state law would be overturned. Am I correct?
I think it would call for fine analysis. The preemption provision that is in this bill is not a field preemption provision which automatically wipes out all state laws on the subject. So I'm not...
You don't know for sure?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid it might. But let's say it doesn't. Is there any reason anybody should be able to get information about about over-the-counter drugs that you get from a pharmacy if that information is hacked into? I mean, this could have real-life serious consequences. This isn't about protecting jobs. This is about protecting people from information that may keep them from getting a job or have others intrude on their personal privacy. So as I understood the gentlelady's amendment, and I want to yield to her, you're seeking in a very narrow way to make sure that if information on people's purchases of drugs is hacked into and someone has that information, that they have to inform the person about whom the information pertains. Is that correct?
That's certainly correct, and it simply adds to what the very limited definitions of personal information include. And frankly, I think that if you ask American people, if they think that their information about what they buy at the drugstore should be protected or not, I think overwhelmingly people would say absolutely. And it is a jobs issue, as I pointed out in my testimony, that there are women, if they reveal that that they're pregnant, may lose the opportunity to have a job or to have a promotion. This is not about limiting businesses. This is about protecting information from hackers.
If there's an herbal substance that's sold, but not as a drug, but it's sold and it's represented to give men sexual vitality, maybe some of the men maybe can't relate to the women, but you can relate to yourself. Do you think that's information other people ought to have? I don't think it's their business. So I support this amendment. I don't understand the argument against it. Something about the FTC doing something or other?
The gentleman would yield.
Yes.
I have before me the California law, and I'm asking for clarification, if possible, from what you were saying. It does say that for purposes of the section, medical information means any information regarding an individual's medical history, mental or physical condition, or medical treatment or diagnoses by a health care professional, but I don't see over-the-counter drugs anywhere in there, but I certainly understand the point you're trying to make and agree with you. Of course, that information should be held private. But that gets back into the belief that, my belief that this is a privacy matter. At the same time, people do willingly give or subscribe to CVS or Rite Aid or whomever, and they get a frequent buyer card, and they do allow those purchases to be tracked. So I agree with you that you do need to protect that, but my problem is in the leap from the fact that I have bought Band-Aids or something, something that I wouldn't want other people to know, whatever it was, that they would make that leap into identifying me as a person and then stealing my identity and using that. I don't know how the combination of my name or a number and that I bought Band-Aids would in fact put me at risk for identity theft. But I agree with the gentleman's and the gentlelady's concern about privacy wholeheartedly. So I'm
Well, this is a data breach bill, and this is the kind of data, if it's breached, should be there should be some response to the person involved that they know that that data has been breached. So I support the gentlelady's amendment.
All right. Is there further discussion on the amendment? All right. Hearing none, the question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. The noes have it.
I ask for a roll call vote.
The gentleman requests a roll call vote, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, nay. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Bass. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, nay. Mr. McKinley. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Barton. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, nay. Mr. Butterfield.
Yes.
Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Towns. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Okay. Mrs. Bonomack.
No.
Mrs. Bonomack, nay.
Are there further members wishing to be recorded? Mr. Stearns?
Mr. Stearns, nay.
Mr. Bass?
Mr. Bass, nay.
Any further members? Seeing none, the clerk will... Dr. Cassidy?
The gentleman's recorded nay.
Okay. The clerk will report the result.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
On that, there were 5 ayes, 10 nays.
How is Mr. Ross recorded?
The gentleman is not recorded.
Mr. Ross?
Mr. Ross, aye.
And seeing any other members wishing to be recorded? Seeing none, the clerk will report.
On that, there were 6 ayes, 10 nays.
All right. With 6 ayes and 10 noes, the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? For what purpose does the gentleman?
What is it? Searches 1, I've been told, is the identifier.
Madam Chairman, reserve a point of order.
The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
Okay, the gentlelady reserves a point of order, and without objection, the reading...
Well, I'd like to have it read. It's very short, and I think it's very self-explanatory, although I'll take some time to explain it further, but let's hear it read.
Clerk will read.
Page 28, line 2, strike definition and insert in general. Page 28, after line 16, insert the following. B, certain online searches. The term personal information also includes records of online searches for health or disease-related information by individuals and other health-related information that the Commission determines should be included in the definition of personal information. Page 28, line 17, strike B and insert C. Page 28, line 19, strike C and insert D.
Madam Chair, if I can be recognized, on this
Gentleman is
amendment.
recognized for
I
5
can't think of any category of information that's more personal than information about our health. Yet this bill, which purports to impose minimum standards for the protection of personal information collected by businesses, makes no effort to protect records of health-related information generated through our online searches and interactions. The Internet has made it possible for each of us to query general and specialized websites about illnesses we're curious about or are suffering from, and drugs and treatments we've heard about or have been prescribed. It's also possible, however, for these same sites and even third parties to track and record our searches for information about symptoms we might be suffering, diseases we want to learn more about, or drugs we have been prescribed. If anyone is going to keep this information about us, they should have some minimum obligation to protect it from unauthorized access and to tell us when security measures have failed to protect this information. My amendment does just that by modifying the definition of personal information to include records of online searches for health or disease-related information. It also grants the FTC the ability to include in the definition of personal information other health-related information it believes should be included. I think this is just self-evident. It's nobody's business what I might or anybody might look for on Internet searches relating to diseases or health. And those who have those websites like WebMD or whatever it might be, if they keep that information and it's hacked into, I should know about it. So I urge support for this amendment. Yield back my time.
Okay. There's a vote on the floor. So at this point, we're going to recess and resume debate on the Waxman Amendment when we return from the floor.
Well, then I will reserve my time.
Okay. So the subcommittee stands in recess. Come to order. When the subcommittee recessed, we had under consideration the Waxman Amendment, and at this point is there further discussion of the Waxman Amendment.
I think there are a lot of people that want to speak in favor of it.
All those people who, Chair will recognize herself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment, and again say to my colleague that I certainly understand what he's trying to do, and I look forward to broader discussions about the privacy topic. And with that, I just will encourage my colleagues to vote against the Waxman Amendment.
Yield. There's something. Would you yield to me?
Yes, I will yield.
I don't understand when you're talking about the piracy. That's a separate bill,
Privacy.
isn't it?
I'm sorry.
Privacy. Right.
Although I like working with you on piracy.
But when you talk about privacy, you're talking about a different bill than this.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
We've had hearings. We hope to have more hearings. I think the hearing that we had last week was very informative. I believe the gentleman participated. And as I was saying to you earlier, I believe that there's a lot that still has to be discussed and a lot of confusion that has to be clarified on both sides of the aisle, and that it really matters for the future of technology and the jobs that we're all talking about. And I really think that privacy is incredibly important, and I would look forward to working with you.
Well, I agree with you if you yield to me further. I absolutely agree with you. I look forward to working on that bill. But we do have this bill, and this bill is to protect data. And what I was trying to do by this amendment is to keep people from getting data that has been aggregated, that has been personalized as well, that should be kept private. And if it's not kept private, then people ought to be able to know about it.
And if the gentleman will
Sure.
yield back, again, it just goes to me, if data is compiled and you have two columns in a database and you have to put those two together to try to create a person and steal their identity, you're not going to be able to do that with some of the information that you're speaking to. And to me, it speaks of privacy. And as I said earlier to the gentleman, privacy is something that I care deeply about. And I know quite a few members on this side of the aisle care a lot about privacy and are very invested in these hearings. And I look forward to your participation. And I do believe that your amendments that you've offered today will be sort of a great guiding path with the privacy discussions as we move forward. And I
Generally, if you'll further. Privacy, I usually think of as what information people can gather about you. But here we're talking about information that's already been collected, and whether that information, once it goes into somebody else's hands improperly through some kind of hacking of the system, whether you should be informed about it. So I just think that they're related, but they're not exactly the same thing.
I think the gentleman, and I agree with you on that point. And again, reclaiming my time, I urge a no vote on the Waxman amendment, and I yield back my time and look to see if there are any other members who wish to speak on the amendment. And seeing none, at this point, yes, we'll be happy. Actually, we will call the roll, but we will postpone it at this point in time until how much longer are you seeking?
I think we only have 2 more amendments.
Okay, so without objection, we will roll the votes until the conclusion of the next 2 amendments. So are there further amendments at the desk?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Which number, Mr. Butterfield?
Let's try purchases 04.
An amendment offered by Mr. Butterfield of North Carolina.
Without objection, the reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his bill.
I thank the chairman. Madam Chairman, this amendment would change the definition of personal information to include records of books and video purchases. Essentially, the effect would be that businesses holding records of book and video purchases would have to secure that information to prevent breaches and notify customers if that information is breached. In the late 1980s, Congress passed the Video Privacy Protection Act to prevent video stores from knowingly disclosing rental records. It did this after the video rental records of President Reagan's failed Supreme Court nominee, Bob Bork, were disclosed to and printed in a newspaper. Congress recognized at that time that the things we watch can say something about us and can potentially be used to embarrass or humiliate us, which is why a newspaper printed those personal records of Judge Bork. The same is true of the books that we read today. However, this bill doesn't consider records kept about the books and videos we have purchased to be personal information, so there's no obligation to protect these records from hacks and other unauthorized access. There's also no obligation to tell me if someone steals this information from whoever was accumulating it. History shows that we previously believed this information to be personal and that its release can cause significant harm. I think it makes good sense to protect this information here too, not just when it is knowingly disclosed. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Is there further discussion on the amendment?
I will yield, Mr. Waxman.
Since you do have time, it's such a simple amendment. It says that records of an individual's purchases and rentals of books and videos and other records of consumer purchases or rentals that the Commission determines should be included in the definition of personal information. This is different than privacy. Privacy would be whether they can get the information about what books you get online or videos you check out online. That's a question of privacy, whether they could get this information. But when you go to Amazon.com and you order books, they have a record of your books. If you go to Netflix, they have a record of your videos. And they have the record. It's not a question of whether they can keep that information or not. They have it. But then the issue gets to be the data and whether when that data is breached, whether the person whose data is affected has the right to know about it. And we even have a law that was adopted by the Congress as a result of the Supreme Court nominee whose videos records were released. This was for Clarence Thomas, and we said, that's outrageous. Why should anybody know what videos he checks out at a video store? Well, that's right. It's nobody's business. But if you check online at a video service, why should anybody else be able to get that information if they hack into Netflix.com or some other source? So I don't know why anybody would object to defining personal information to include records of individual purchases of books and videos and other consumer purchase. So I just think it makes a lot of sense. I can't see an argument against it. I want to join you in urging our colleagues to support it.
I thank the gentleman for supporting the amendment. And as the gentleman said, this is so simple. Book purchases, video purchases. We want to protect those and make those secure. Thank you, Mr. Waxman. I yield back.
Madam Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Madam Chairman, if I can ask your indulgence for just a moment, I want to clarify that I offered purchases 2 and not purchases 1.
I thank the gentleman.
Thank you. Okay. I yield back.
And the chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Hampshire for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I won't take anywhere near 5 minutes. I have respect for many of the amendments that have been offered by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but I don't know where this ends. This is a financial harm, financially, at least as I understand it, related bill relating to identity theft. I am as concerned as anyone else about the use of data that might be damaging, especially if you don't know where it's going and what's happening. But this is, I mean, at some point, we're going to try to include every single commercial transaction that ever occurs. And now we're down, if you will, to video rentals and I don't know what else, books. If you read a book, you're going to have some regulation concerning that. And this whole discussion belongs, I think, in a different venue. And I appreciate the line of debate here, but this kind of an amendment at this level, I think, is inappropriate in the context of the mission and purpose of this bill. So I oppose the amendment and yield back.
Gentleman, yield to me. What do you think is the purpose of the bill?
I think the purpose of the bill is to protect consumers from financial harm, financial fraud. I think that there is a legitimate debate that we could have about some of the earlier amendments that you proposed, especially the first one. And we may have an opportunity to talk about that. But at some point, I could draft an amendment that would broaden the scope of this legislation to include parking meter information or bus tokens or subway tickets or I don't know.
Well, certainly you can distinguish between that and your medical records.
This bill, I don't think this amendment relates to medical records. This is an amendment that relates to individual purchases.
But you were willing...
my discussion of this amendment related to whether or not it was appropriate to include books and videos and purchases and rentals in a bill which I thought or recalled had been primarily focused on data security relating to Social Security records, credit card numbers, and so forth. I just see this. A friend from California understand that there may be a legitimate reason to be concerned about this, but is this really relevant, or is this a digression?
Well, if the gentleman would yield.
Certainly.
We're talking about data breaches, where the information about you has already been gathered and it's stored, and someone is able to breach that and get into it. And if the people holding that data know that there has been a breach, you would agree they ought to inform you on your financial matters, but why shouldn't they have to inform you about your personal health matters that when that has been breached?
Well, fair enough. I certainly understand your point, but it's a much larger issue that I do not believe should be a part of an internal part of this legislation, especially at this level.
If the gentleman would yield.
Certainly. The gentlelady from Tennessee.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding, and I would just point my colleagues' attention to the second part of this amendment, line 4 after the comma. And other records of consumer purchases or rentals that the Commission determines should be included in the definition of personal information. Well, we made a decision in the first amendment that was offered, Mr. Olson's amendment, where we said we were not going to give this rulemaking authority. We were not going to have them have that APA rulemaking authority. It is for Congress to make that decision. So while we may want to say that this is just about books and videos, I think the overreach is contained in page, lines 5, 6, and 7 of the amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to vote no.
Would the gentleman
Bill
from New
back.
Hampshire yield to me? I could see your argument. I don't agree with it, but I could see your argument that this bill is about financial matters that are data that's breached, and you don't want to go beyond it into these other personal matters. But this bill that's before us preempts states from dealing with that. So if your state of New Hampshire wants to say that your health information, if that information has been breached, you are entitled to be informed about it.
Reclaiming what few seconds I
have.
have left, the amendment before us has to do with books, videos, and other records of consumer purchases, and I would respectfully suggest that this is going far beyond what some of the earlier amendments.
Do you think that your state ought to be preempted from passing laws in this area?
I think it.
I ask unanimous consent the gentleman be able to answer.
I believe that the subject of whether or not books, videos, and other records of consumer purchase or rentals should not be part of a federal data security bill that is whose primary function was to deal with the issue of financial harm, fraud, and other abuses that are associated with
And why should the bill preempt states in those areas?
I believe that this bill, which is the bill that was closely mimics or follows the bill that was brought up not only in 2005 but last year, is unnecessarily expanded by the amendments that are being offered by the gentleman from California and others on the other side of the aisle. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? For what purpose?
Ask the council a question. Does this bill preempt states from passing laws on data breaches when it comes to questions like health information or what videos or you get or any other kind of information that a lot of people would consider private? The underlying bill itself, doesn't it preempt the states?
It preempts the states on laws that are, quote, similar to those under Section 2. So you had asked me a question about this before, and my comment was that I think it calls for careful analysis because the preemption is not a sweeping preemption, but rather is defined in terms of things that are similar to what our bill does.
Well, the language in the bill says this act supersedes any provision of a statute, regulation, or rule of a state or political subdivision of a state with respect to any entity subject to this act that contains, one, requirements for information, security practices, or treatment of data similar to those under Section 2, or requirements for notification of a breach of security similar to the notification required under Section 3. Now let's go back to Section 2. Section 2, if anybody could point that out to me. Section 2 says, no, I don't think that's it. Such regulation shall take into consideration a security policy with respect to the collection, use, sale, or other dissemination and maintenance of such personal information. And then, of course, we're defining what personal information is. The bill, council, defines personal information with regard to financial issues only. Is that your understanding?
It could be interpreted that similar would confine this preemption to provisions that are similar in scope and content to the ones that are in our bill.
The preemption talks about data. Data is pretty broad, isn't it?
But the term similar, I interpret as modifying statute, regulation, or rule of a state that is similar to those under Section 2.
And Section 2 says anything that's considered personal, corrective actions. Such regulations consideration of the quantity, type, nature, and sensitivity of the personal information. I just don't see what is the reason for preemption?
The reason for preemption is to avoid the states regulating in the same area as the federal government.
Well, the way I read this is we're not regulating at the federal level a lot of data that's breached. We're not regulating that at the federal level, and then we're telling the states, don't you regulate it either. And I don't see the reason for that, and I just want to point that out to my colleagues. Yield back,
Madam Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word for the purpose of asking counsel a question.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Counsel, my question is this. Are there any states that use video, book, these type purchases as personally identifiable information? Is there any state that uses this for PII?
I can only say that I am not personally aware of any states. In our review of state laws, we did not identify that, but I can't be certain that there's no state law.
So to your knowledge, there are no
To my
states.
knowledge, no.
Okay. Would this information and the privacy or protection of this not be covered under the Video Protection Privacy Act?
I would have to study that issue and get back to you. I'm not certain of whether it would be covered under the Video Privacy Act. I know Mr. Butterfield referred to it in his remarks.
Thank you. Madam Chairman, I think that one of the things that we all are wanting to be careful of and that our constituents talk to us regularly about is not setting up duplicative rules, not getting into this situation where the agencies are into a turf battle of who's responsible for what and what laws are going to come first in the queue, if you will. So I would again, for those concerns, and in light of those current concerns, they do heighten my reservations, and I continue to urge a no vote. Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment, and we will roll that vote until after the next amendment. So are there further amendments at the desk?
Madam Chair, since council is present, and I want to return to a subject that we had discussed earlier, and I have this inquiry of council. Council, you advised us earlier this morning that there could be instances in which a, quote, service provider, end of quote, would be deemed a third-party agent. In those cases, would a service provider be able to avail itself of the service provider exemptions in this act?
They could, but the service provider exemption in this act does not cover everything that a service provider would do.
So you're saying that a service provider would be able to avail themselves, and I really would just ask for a yes or no answer if I can.
The service provider exemption does not cover everything that a service provider can do. So it is a limited exemption.
So they are exempted. And the answer is yes. They are. They do have an exemption. They can be exempted. Is that correct?
They are exempt for. Well, they're not exempt, but they are. Their requirements for their obligation to protect information is limited in the case of information that flows through their systems by transmission or transient storage.
So when they're doing cloud computing and hosted services, are they exempt doing that?
The exemption relates to electronic communications by a third party that is transmitted, routed, or stored in intermediate or transient storage by such service provider. But what I'm saying is that a service provider could provide could be involved in other kinds of things that involved something other than is covered by the exemption. And the very case that you raised earlier might be one of those. That is, there could be situations where, for example, long-term storage were involved that could change the result and would be covered by the bill. So it's this, the exemption for service providers, in other words, is primarily focused on communications flow through service provider connections. I hope I'm being responsive.
Yeah, thank you. I think the answer is really yes to my question, right? Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. You're back.
All right, are there any further amendments?
Yeah, I do have an amendment on the desk, though.
Madam Chairman, parliamentary inquiry before we go to that.
The gentleman will state his inquiry.
On the last vote, you didn't even call for a roll call vote. Wouldn't it, I mean a voice vote, wouldn't it be in order to have a voice vote and then determining how that, which side prevails, determine if there's going to be a roll call vote? Or did you're just rolling every vote?
We had decided that we would roll the last three and didn't determine at that time whether they're voiced or we just said we would roll them. So the gentleman makes a very good point that this can be quite confusing at times up here.
Okay. No, if that was the agreement, I wasn't here, I understand, and I withdraw my parliamentary inquiry.
Thank the gentleman. Okay, and so the business the gentleman has in the minute.
Madam Chair, I do have an amendment that that was before the subcommittee earlier, and we had to.
Okay, the clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Yeah, Madam Chair, in the interest of time, I basically have already made my argument that the subcommittee passed this amendment, and those arguments are still pertinent right now. So I would also ask that we vote pass this amendment.
All right, the gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Anybody? All right. The chair will recognize herself for a brief response in opposition to the amendment, and again thank the gentleman for his leadership and his knowledge on this issue that has percolated through Congress for many years, and also to my colleague from Florida. They've worked hard on this issue, and just say that replacing this bill by going backwards is not a step forward, and that I do believe that there have been changes. The bill that we have, for example, includes nonprofit entities. It does a whole host of things that are improvements, and I do believe that I've repeatedly said and others have said between today's markup and full committee, we can continue to work together to address all of the concerns. And with that, I will just urge a no vote from my colleagues.
Madam Chair, I'm wondering if I could strike the last word.
I'll yield back my time. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. As many of us remember, last Congress, Mr. Rush, along with a bipartisan group of members from this committee, introduced H.R. 2221, the Data Accountability and Trust Act. And that piece of legislation was a consensus product that passed through the subcommittee, the full committee, and the full House, all by voice votes. Months of stakeholder meetings and staff discussions and tough compromises preceded its passage. While the Senate did not act on the bill, it was not for lack of support in the House on both sides of the aisle. The Safe Data Act departs from H.R. 2221 in many crucial ways. It was created essentially by one side of the aisle. The FTC, FCC, and NTIA all oppose it. But the main reason we should vote the Safe Data Act down is not because of the process or who supports it. We should reject it because it's bad policy, and I propose that we replace it with the text of a much more palatable piece of legislation. And I think that we have that before us now. in the Rush Amendment. From a policy standpoint, H.R. 2221 was much easier to swallow than the bill before us for several reasons. First, the FTC had the ability to modify the definition of, quote, personal information, unquote, without undue burden. This permitted the House to pass the bill knowing that as time went on, the definition of personal information could be kept up to date through the rulemaking process. Future regulators would not be boxed in, left only capable of enforcing the law for what was considered, quote, personal information in 2005. The Safe Data Act, by contrast, would force the FTC to reach such a high bar for non-interference with technological innovation and commerce as to render it completely unable to ever alter the definition of personal information. Second, H.R. 2221 included a section of special requirements for information brokers, those third-party entities whose business is to collect, assemble, or maintain personal information. Information brokers are at the center of the market for America's personal data, often possessing hundreds of data points on each of us, including demographic, financial, and even medical information. If information is stolen from them, it is likely to be more sensitive and comprehensive than if taken from other entities. Moreover, if information brokers possess inaccurate data, it is likely to reach farther and to be sold to more entities than if inaccuracies exist in the databases of other types of companies. Under H.R. 2221, information brokers were required to submit their security policies to FTC review, permit FTC audits of their security practices if they experienced a breach, and provide certain access and correction rights to consumers. By contrast, the Safe Data Act has no special requirements for information brokers, having completely stripped out that section of the bill. And third, H.R. 2221 created only targeted exemptions for the breach of public record information. That legislation differentiated public record information from other personal data for only two reasons. One, so that if the consumer found a record of theirs that needed to be corrected and the source of this information was the public record, the data holder only was required to refer the consumer to the source of the information and, if reasonably available, to where a request for correction may be directed. And two, for the purposes of the affirmative defense against enforcement under the breach notification requirements, not the data security requirements. By contrast, the Safe Data Act completely exempts public record information from coverage, leaving consumers vulnerable to identity theft, fraud, and other serious acts. These three areas best exemplify why the text of H.R. 2221 is preferable to the bill before us today, but they are not the only ones, and I encourage my colleagues to remember the bill we produced last year and urge them to move the text of H.R. 2221 forward rather than the seriously flawed and partisan Safe Data Act before us today. And I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition? The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
The bill that was passed last year protected personal information, and personal information was more broadly defined than what we see in this bill, as I understand it. So, thanks. Under the current bill, the underlying bill, most personal information stored online or on company databases are not protected. They're just not protected. What is protected under the bill itself is your first name, your last name, your address, phone number, Social Security number, driver's license, military identification, financial account number, credit or debit card number, any required security codes to access that. Does not include public records. So as I read this, if we're trying to protect people's financial well-being, you can protect access to your account, but if somebody hacked your credit card account, you're not entitled to be informed about the hacking of what they got, the information they got from your credit card. Only if they got your security code, access code, or password. And similarly, when we talk about the term personal information, you have personal emails. So if that's taken, then there's no requirement to inform you of that. We talked about videos and books and other consumer purchases. But how about purchases for over-the-counter drugs? That's a commercial kind of activity. Over-the-counter drugs could include pregnancy tests. That's not protected. You could say it's not a financial record, but on the other hand, it's personal information. And if there's a breach of that personal information, you should be informed of it. The other area where we talk about definition of personal information in last year's bill, it's been narrowed. It's been narrowed beyond recognition. The bill retains provisions that preempt state laws, and if we're going to preempt the state laws, we ought to have a strong federal one, but this bill eliminates a lot of state consumer protections without putting equivalent or stronger federal protections in place. So what we have is a term, personal information, and personal information is defined only in terms of what's spelled out in the bill. Not your email accounts, but maybe your password. Not your financial records, but only your access numbers to get to that financial information. And if somebody got through and got that information, I can't see why we wouldn't want to have that data breach as something for which you would be informed that someone has breached the data that's been stored in these records. So I support the proposal to go back to last year's bill. It passed unanimously, and it ought to be acceptable now. I certainly yield.
I thank the gentleman. A question for counsel. Can you please tell me the differences between 2577 and then the substitute bill other than public records as far as identifying PII?
The definition of personal information, what's defined as personal information by the bill, is identical between the two bills.
I yield back to
Well, let me ask counsel further on. But we have more specific identifications. Was that in the previous bill? If you look at the language in this bill, definition, the term personal information means, and you go through all of this, but then beyond that, it says the Commission may, by rule promulgated under 553 of U.S. Code, modify the definition of personal information to the extent such modification is necessary to accomplish the purpose of such section as a result of changes in technology or practices and will not unreasonably impede technological advances. Term access to or acquisition of the additional data elements in the breach of security would create an unreasonable risk of identity theft, fraud, or other unlawful conduct that such modification will not unreasonably impede. So we leave it to the FTC in the other bill to go further, and that's removed by the amendments, certainly that have been adopted today, and I believe the bill. Is that right, counsel? FTC can't define personal information more broadly than what's spelled out.
It can, but you can only do so by certain procedures and under certain circumstances. And the same was true under the Rush bill.
And we have submitted that those procedures that were now by amendment have been offered prevent the FTC from acting. That's been the historical record. I think that we're too narrow, and I think the bill we had before left open the ability for the FTC to expand that personal information definition. And I think that's one of the things people on the other side of the aisle don't want. They don't want the FTC going into that issue and broadening it.
The gentleman's time has expired.
So I support the Rush amendment.
All right. Is there further discussion on the
Madam Chair.
speaks recognition? Oh, yes.
Madam Chair, I'm going to strike last word. I won't take up a lot of time, Madam Chair, but I just...
Excuse me.
Am I recognized?
Well, I believe under if Ms. Schakowsky could be recognized, and because you were already recognized, and
I'll claim the time, Madam Chairman. Yes, I asked to strike the requisite number of words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield to the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you.
Madam
Gentleman's
Chair,
recognized for 5 minutes.
as Mr. Waxman pointed out, this is a data security bill. The SAFE Act is a data access bill. That approach does not protect American citizens. I might add that the Republicans, based on the comments today, would have you to believe that we're taking a privacy approach. We're not. We're talking about personal PII, or personally identifiable information. And I think that that is something that we need to keep in the forefront as we begin to deliberate and take action on this bill. Lastly, Madam Chairman, I just have to say that last year, the reason why we had a bipartisan bill was because we had bipartisan input. We had input from Mr. Markey and from Mr. Stearns. We had from Radonovich, from Mr. Barton. I mean, it was the height of an exemplified bipartisanship that produced that. Not only here in the subcommittee, but when we went to the full committee, same thing. All right, strong cooperation, because the number one priority was to protect the data of the American citizens. When we went to the floor, same thing, unanimous. I think we had one vote on the floor in opposition. The bill passed. Yes, they learned their message. It was under suspension, under voice vote. We passed under suspension. So we weren't here, And Madam Chair, I just want to say this, all motion is not movement, and certainly all motion is not progress. All right, we're having a lot of motion here, but we're not progressing. I say we're digressing, because this is the kind of legislation, and this is a moment where we should exemplify to the American people a strong sense of bipartisanship, because we all agree about that this is a severe problem that we're suffering under, and that the American people are faced with. And for us to now go into our respective corners and quibble and argue and fight about things that are nonsensical, I just think that it really kind of is a disservice, and really kind of makes us, it demeans this whole process. For the life of me, I just don't see why we are, the bill that's before us right now, in my opinion, Madam Chairman, and I do this respectfully, out of a sense of utter respect for you as the chairman, but I just think that it's an inferior bill, and we're passing out inferior legislation. And the question that I have is the same question that Mr. Waxman asked. Why are we doing this? Why are we trying to, are we trying to, again, hamstring another federal agency? I mean, there's no agency in the federal government that have more public support than the Federal Trade Commission.
If the gentleman
Not one agency. I will yield, Madam Chair, but let me just make this point. There's not one agency in the federal government that has more support, widespread support among the consumers, all right, than the FTC. And let us not hamstring that one agency that has been doing a remarkable job over the years. I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman and appreciate his comments. And just the great question, why are we doing this? And first of all, yes, we've passed it out of the House a couple of times to go nowhere. You know, and every bill in this Congress deserves a fresh look. The American people deserve that. Not only that, elections bring different people to the House and a different set of eyeballs and a different set of ideas and a different set of constituencies. And that's why we are where we are today. It is a new time. It is a new bill. And I appreciate very much the comments that I've heard from your side of the aisle suggesting that we work together and look for bipartisanship. I still believe that's possible. And I don't know the calendar between now and the fall, but I look forward to very robust discussions with all of you and recognize that the Congress is different now. And the sentiment of the Congress might be different than it was last Congress or the Congress before that and before that. And the goal, it is my goal and the goal of this subcommittee to get something signed into law. And continue to say, well, it passed the House and it was not contested, and it's just not good enough anymore. So I appreciate the gentleman yielding to me, and I...
I'm sorry, reclaim, if I just got a minute, reclaiming my time. I want to say the outlook for this bill in terms of it is going to, I think, and I'm not trying to predict what's going to happen in the future. I don't know. But I don't think this bill is going to become law either.
And Madam Chair, has expired.
Madam Chair.
And thank you. For what purpose does the gentleman seek?
Move to strike.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think you made a great point. I mean, the point here is H.R. 2221 by my colleague from Illinois did have bipartisan input, and you know, that's a great thing. And I think this, in many cases, replicates that bipartisan input. So when you have a bill that I think really kind of steps it up a little bit, takes the advantage of having another little bit of time to look at the changes we need to make. That's it. H.R. 2221 didn't accomplish many of its other goals as clearly or concisely as it could have. We haven't wrecked H.R. 2221, but we've improved it. For instance, 2577 ensures that the innocent consumer who holds information on another and suffers a breach, you ever had your email account hacked, is not ensnared in this federal regulation by tying the holding of information to interstate activity. 2577 also clarifies that covered entities include data brokers and third-party agents such as cloud providers. And this is a new technology that nobody really knew what a cloud was just a few months ago, rather than having duplicative provisions for those entities. It also distills the bill to its main goal of ensuring data security of information held regardless of how it's gathered. How information is gathered is something we should address in the privacy context. It makes the carve-outs for GLBA and HIPAA-covered activities explicit rather than requiring a federal agency to judge whether its sister agencies' regimes are protective enough. That's not the job of a federal agency. That's our responsibility. Responsibility that the language of 2221 would abdicate. Accepting this substitute amendment would get rid of the new requirement to have a data minimalization plan, something nearly every Democrat applauded at the legislative hearing. Accepting the substitute amendment would also mean the FTC would not have jurisdiction over nonprofits like charities or universities who literally hold personal information on tens of thousands of people. And it would also mean consumers would not be notified that a hacker accessed their information as quickly as would be required under this bill. It further means that the FTC would not have the flexibility to take into consideration a business's size or type, quantity, and sensitivity of data held when promulgating its security rules, given needed flexibility for small businesses. I think what's obvious here is that, you know, look, we can take a bill that had bipartisan input under the other side of the House having the majority. Now that we have the majority, take that too and continue to take input and make it what we think is a little bit better. So with that, I yield back, and I thank the chair.
Well, the gentleman, yeah, just for a moment. Well, the gentleman, yeah, you know, something that this bill lacks something that's really so basic to the protection of the American consumer. You know, access and correction. That provision is not included in this bill. So that means that if someone got erroneous data in their possession and you are aware of it, you have the consumer have no right to access that information nor to correct that information. So that information, if this bill were to pass, in perpetuity will continue to be erroneous information. That will bring untold harmful effects.
Well, in reclaiming my time, and I appreciate that concern, and that's something that, I'm sure we'd be happy to continue to discuss. But when we talk about this amendment, which replaces this bill, 2577, and takes it to the old one, again, with bipartisan support, but this would basically replace some of the good provisions I've talked about. So with that, I yield back, and I thank the chair for the vote.
The gentleman yields back. Anybody else wishing to speak? Hearing nobody else. If there are no further amendments, we will now vote on the rolled votes. First up is a vote on the Waxman amendment, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, nay. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, nay. Mr. McKinley. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, present. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, nay. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Towns. Mr. Towns, aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, nay. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mrs. Bono-Mack.
No.
Mrs. Bono-Mack, nay.
Are there further members seeking to vote?
Mr. Matheson, nay.
The clerk will report.
On that, there were 6 ayes, 12 nays, and 1 present.
6 ayes and 12 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. And next we have a vote on the Butterfield amendment. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. And the amendment is not agreed to. So the amendment is, the next vote will be on the Rush amendment, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, nay. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, nay. Mr. McKinley. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, nay. Mr. Butterfield.
Yes.
Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Towns. Mr. Towns, aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mrs. Bono-Mack.
No.
Mrs. Bono-Mack, nay.
The clerk will report. Or there, yeah.
Same. Katie? On that, there were 9 ayes, 10 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting the bill to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. So as the legislation moves forward, I want to assure everyone that I'll continue to work with Mr. Butterfield and Mr. Waxman and all of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to see if we can find common ground. At the end of the day, we all want the very same thing, new safeguards that will better protect American consumers in the future. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill approved by subcommittee today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I thank all members and staff, and the subcommittee stands adjourned subject to call of the chair.